The name broke from his lips, sharp and brittle, dissolving immediately into the grey vapour choking the Bishopsgate courtyard. No echo returned. The frost swallowed the sound before it could rebound from the brickwork, consuming the shout within the stagnant air. Sergeant Robert Bentley stood rigid against the station wall, boots planted on cobblestone slick with a glaze of invisible ice. He did not shiver. To shiver was to admit the body held claim over the uniform, and Bentley had long since surrendered those rights to the ledger. Around him, 12 constables formed a ragged semicircle, breath pluming in thick, grey ribbons that hung suspended before settling as a fine, damp mist on the wool of their tunics. The smell was distinct: wet dog, stale tobacco, and the acrid tang of coal smoke drifting from 1,000 chimneys across the city, all trapped under a lid of freezing fog that tasted of copper and soot. Present, Constable Miller grunted, shifting his weight. The leather of his belt creaked, a dry, protesting sound like a boot stepping on a frozen beetle. Bentley's eyes moved down the line. 1, 2, 3. He counted heads, not names, a mechanical habit drilled into him since the academy, yet the rhythm always snagged on the same 3 gaps. Behind the men, frost had seized the iron railings, turning the metal into a brittle skeleton that might snap if leaned upon too hard. It was 26 degrees below freezing, the kind of cold that turned pocket watch springs into useless wire and made door latches stick fast in their frames. A mechanical antagonist. The world was contracting, shrinking inward until there was no room for error, no room for mercy, no room for the dead. Higgins, here, Sarge. Thorn, sir. The voices were flat, muffled by scarves pulled high against the bite of the wind. Bentley's own throat felt raw, the air scraping down his windpipe like ground glass. He cleared it, a harsh, barking sound that startled a pigeon roosting on the gas lamp above. The bird took flight, its wings beating a frantic rhythm against the silence, then vanished into the murk. He looked at the space where Sergeant Tucker should have been standing, third from the left, just past the archway. Tucker would have straightened his tunic before answering, a nervous tick he'd never quite broken, his fingers worrying the bottom button even in this weather. Tucker was dead, shot through the heart in a hallway in Houndsditch 3 weeks ago. The blood had soaked into the floorboards, dark and viscous, refusing to clot quickly in the chill of that unheated room. Bentley skipped the name. He did not speak it. To speak it was to make it real again, to drag the corpse out of the mortuary slab and into the morning roll call. Constable Choate. Silence. Not a peaceful quiet. This was a heavy, pressing absence, a vacuum that sucked the warmth from the courtyard. Choate had died next, slumped against a washstand, his revolver empty, his face twisted in a rictus of surprise that the world could end so abruptly. The gap in the line yawned wider than the physical distance allowed. Bentley could see the ghost of Choate's cap, the imaginary slouch of his shoulders. The other men stared straight ahead, jaws clenched, pretending the empty spaces were filled with fog, with nothingness, with anything but the men they had carried out in boxes. Woodhams. Another void. Woodhams, who had a wife expecting in March. Woodhams, whose laugh usually cut through the station house gloom like a knife. Now just a hole in the formation, a negative space that screamed louder than the shouting of the living. Bentley's gloved hand tightened on his notebook. The leather cover was stiff, frozen solid, threatening to crack if he forced it open. He ran a thumb over the edge, feeling the rough grain. 12 present, 3 absent, the arithmetic of the ambush, the sum total of the City of London Police's failure in December. Right, Bentley said, his voice lower, now rougher. Kit inspection, draw your pieces. The movement was sluggish, 12 men reaching for 12 holsters, the action hampered by thick gloves and numbed fingers, leather flaps lifted with sticky resistance, steel scraped against wool, the sound of preparation, of men arming themselves against a war that had already happened and was yet to begin again. Bentley drew his own Webley MKVI. The weight of it was familiar, a comforting heaviness in his palm, but as he thumb-cocked the hammer, the mechanism refused to travel. It stuck, half-cock, a dead click. He frowned, pressing his thumb harder against the serrated spur. Nothing. The cylinder sat locked, fused to the frame by oil that had turned to glycerine sludge in the frost, a useless lump of iron. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest, distinct from the weather. If a Mauser C-96 appeared around the corner now, if the Latvians stepped out of the fog with their automatics, he would be holding a paperweight. He would be dead before he could clear the jam. He shoved the revolver back into his holster, hiding the failure. "Miller," he barked, masking the tremor in his hands with volume. "Check your lock, report." "Seized up, Sarge," Miller muttered, wrestling with his own weapon. "Oil's gone thick as treacle." "Warm them," Bentley ordered, the command tasting like ash. "Stomachs, armpits, do whatever you must. I want functioning steel, not ice sculptures." The men huddled closer, tucking their weapons inside their tunics, pressing the cold metal against their living heat. It was undignified. It was against regulation to handle firearms in such a manner, to treat the Queen's issue like a child's toy needing warmth. But regulations did not account for 26 degrees of frost. Regulations had not stopped 3 bullets from tearing through Tucker's chest. Bentley watched them, this circle of men trying to thaw the machinery of death with their own body heat. He turned his collar up against the drift. The station house smelled of wet wool and stale tobacco, a cloying fug that did little to mask the underlying scent of cordite, which seemed to have seeped into the very mortar of Bishopsgate. Bentley dismissed the men with a sharp nod, watching them scatter towards the warmth of the canteen, their shoulders hunched against a cold that had already bypassed their uniforms and settled in the bone. He remained in the courtyard for a moment longer, listening to the retreating scuff of boots on frozen cobblestones, before turning back towards the desk where the ledger lay open. The book was a thick, leather-bound monster, its pages stiff with the humidity of the room, filled with the neat, cramped script of a dozen different hands recording the decline of order in the East End. He sat, the wooden chair groaning under his weight, and pulled the log from December 16th towards him. The ink on the page was dry, black, and unforgiving, but the words swam before his eyes, rearranging themselves into the geometry of the hallway at 119 Houndsditch. He needed to find the discrepancy. It nagged at him, a loose thread in a well-tailored coat, the Metropolitan Police report stating 12 shots fired by the suspects, while Bentley's own count, etched into his memory with the precision of a chisel, was 14. 2 bullets unaccounted for, 2 rounds that might have struck Tucker had the trajectory been a degree lower, or Choate had he not ducked. Or perhaps they were still lodged in the plaster, waiting to be dug out by a future tenant unaware of the history embedded in their wall. Bentley picked up his pen, the nib cold against his fingers, and traced the line item describing the initial exchange. Suspects opened fire upon entry. Vague, useless. It lacked the specific, brutal rhythm of the event, the crack of the first shot, the hesitation, the sudden roar of the automatic pistol that had turned the narrow corridor into a kill box. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping harsh against the floorboards, and walked to the corner of the room where a large-scale map of the district was pinned. His finger found Houndsditch, tracing the route they had taken, the path that should have been routine, a simple burglary call that had mutated into an execution. The paper was rough under his glove. He could almost feel the texture of the wallpaper in that hallway, the floral pattern torn by Lade, the plaster dust hanging in the air like a grey mist that tasted of copper and sulfur. Tucker had fallen first, not a dramatic collapse, but a sudden folding, as if his knees had simply given up the struggle against gravity. The blood had not flowed immediately. The cold had sealed the wounds, keeping the life inside him for a few precious, agonizing seconds before the dam broke. 12, Bentley whispered, the number hanging in the empty room. They said 12. He shook his head, a sharp, jerky motion. The Met's incompetence was a running joke in the city, a source of quiet superiority for his own force, but this was not funny. This was a miscount of the dead. If they could not count the shots, how could they count the men? How could they hunt a ghost if they did not know how many ghosts there were? The error felt personal, an insult to the memory of the men who had bled on those floorboards. It suggested a carelessness, a bureaucratic shrug that said 3 lives were worth only a cursory glance, a quick tally before the paperwork was filed away in some dusty archive in Whitehall. Bentley grabbed his coat, the heavy wool stiff with the chill of the courtyard, and shrugged it on. He needed to see it again, not the body, not the blood, but the space, the angles, the light. The report claimed the suspects had fired from the corner of the room, yet the bullet holes in the doorframe suggested a position closer to the window, a difference of 3 feet that would have altered the entire dynamic of the ambush. 3 feet, the distance between life and the morgue. He buttoned the coat, his fingers fumbling slightly with the frozen toggles, and checked his pocket watch. 10 minutes. He could be there and back before the superintendent returned from his meeting at the Guildhall. Going out, Sarge. Miller stood in the doorway, a mug of tea steaming in his hand, the smell of strong brew cutting through the stale air. His face was flushed from the heat of the canteen, a stark contrast to the pallor of the courtyard. Checking a detail, Bentley said, avoiding the man's eyes. The Houndstitch log, the shot count is wrong. Miller took a sip, the steam curling around his nose. Met's lot, they'd struggled to count their own fingers in a fog, sir. Leave it be, it's done. It's not done if the numbers don't add up, Miller. Bentley's voice was tight, clipped. If we don't know what we are facing, we're just walking into the same trap again. There's nothing left to see, Sarge. They've patched the walls, swept the glass. It's just a shop again. Miller shifted his weight, the floorboard creaking under his boot. Besides, it's Met territory. We got no jurisdiction there unless they ask. We have jurisdiction over our dead, Bentley snapped, the words coming out sharper than he intended. He saw Miller flinch, the mug tilting slightly, a drop of tea spilling onto the constable's thumb. I won't have them erased by a clerk's error. He pushed past Miller, the shoulder of his coat brushing against the younger man's arm, and stepped out into the corridor. The air here was colder, the draft whistling through the cracks in the sash windows. He could feel the weight of the Webley in his holster, the metal still cool against his hip despite the time spent warming it. It was a reminder of the failure, the jammed cylinder that could have cost him his life if the ambush had happened today. He touched the grip, his fingers curling around the checkered wood, reassuring himself that it was there, that he was armed, that he was not helpless. The walk to Houndstitch was short, a mere 10 minutes through the labyrinth of streets that separated the financial heart of the city from the ragged edges of the East End. The fog had thickened, clinging to the ground like a living thing, obscuring the gas lamps and turning the world into a series of grey vignettes. Horses plodded past, their breath pluming in the air, the iron shoes ringing hollow on the frozen pavement. Bentley kept his head down, his collar turned up, avoiding the gaze of the few pedestrians who braved the cold. They looked like ghosts themselves, muffled in scarves and hats, their eyes downcast, hurriedly moving from one pocket of warmth to another. He turned the corner onto Houndstitch, and the shop came into view. 119. It looked ordinary. The windows were clean, the display of jewelry bright under the electric lights, the door freshly painted. There was no sign of the violence that had torn through it 3 weeks ago. No bullet holes, no bloodstains, just a polite, respectable storefront selling watches and rings to those who could afford them. But Bentley knew better. He could see the ghost of the damage, the invisible scars that ran beneath the surface. He stopped on the opposite pavement, watching the flow of traffic, the omnibuses rumbling past, their engines chugging in the cold. A woman emerged from the shop, clutching a small parcel to her chest. She glanced at Bentley, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of his uniform, before hurrying away, her skirt swishing against the frozen ground. Bentley waited until she was gone, then crossed the street. He approached the door, his hand hovering over the handle. He could feel the eyes of the dead on him, Tucker, Choate, Woodhams, waiting for him to get it right, to find the truth that lay hidden in the geometry of the room. He pushed the door open, the bell above it chiming a cheerful, incongruous note, and stepped inside. The air within was warm, scented with polish and metal. The shopkeeper, a small man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you, officer?" "Just looking," Bentley said, his voice low. He moved towards the back of the shop, towards the door that led to the hallway. The incident, December 16th. The shopkeeper's face tightened, a flicker of fear crossing his features before he masked it with a polite smile. "Ah, yes, terrible business, all cleaned up now as you can see, good as new." "Show me the hallway," Bentley said, ignoring the pleasantry. The man hesitated, wiping his hands on a cloth. "I'm not sure, the customers." "Now," Bentley said, the command brooking no argument. The shopkeeper sighed, stepping out from behind the counter and leading the way. He opened the door to the hallway, revealing a narrow space painted a bland cream color. The wallpaper was new, a simple pattern of vines and leaves hiding the scars beneath. Bentley stepped inside, the air suddenly cooler, the light dimmer. He ran his gloved finger along the wall, feeling for the patch, the slight unevenness where the plaster had been repaired. There, just above the skirting board, a bump, a memory of lead. 12 shots, he murmured, tracing the line of the damage, but the angle is wrong. He crouched, examining the floorboards. They had been replaced, the wood newer, lighter than the rest. But the gap between the boards was too wide, a sign of a hasty repair. And there in the corner, a tiny speck of blue, paint, no fabric, a fragment of uniform, Choate's tunic, or perhaps just a thread from a worker's smock. It didn't matter. It was a detail the Met had missed. A detail that spoke of haste, of a desire to bury the past rather than understand it. Bentley stood up, his knees cracking in the silence. He looked at the shopkeeper, who was hovering in the doorway, his expression a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Who did the repairs? Local builder, sir. Name of Evans. Why? Never mind. Bentley turned back to the wall, his mind racing. The angle of the shots, the position of the men, the missing bullets, it all pointed to one thing. The suspects had not been where the report said they were. They had moved, flanked, executed a tactical maneuver that the Met had failed to recognize. These were not common thieves, they were soldiers. And if they were soldiers, they would not stop, for they would regroup, rearm, and strike again. The cold certainty of it settled in Bentley's stomach, heavier than the frost outside. The hunt was not over, it had barely begun. He walked back out into the shop, the bell chiming again as he exited. The fog had rolled in thicker, swallowing the street, turning the world into a grey void. He pulled his collar up, feeling the first flake of soot from a passing dray settle on the pristine wool. It was a small stain, almost invisible, but it was there. A mark of the city, of the grime that clung to everything, that seeped into the pores and stained the soul. He started walking, his footsteps echoing on the pavement, heading back towards the station, but his mind was already elsewhere, planning the next move, the next breach of protocol. The ledger was wrong, and he would be the one to correct it, no matter the cost. The fog swallowed him whole, a grey shroud that hid the living from the dead and the hunter from the hunted. The click-clack died, swallowed by the thick, wet wool of the fog, before a single spark could fly. Bentley hit the ground hard, knees cracking against the frozen cobbles, the impact jarring his teeth. He dragged himself behind the coal chute, the rough bricks scraping the elbow of his greatcoat, tearing a thread that dangled like a loose nerve. Down, he shouted again, though the order was redundant, a reflex born of houndstitch where shouting had changed nothing. Miller and Halloway scrambled, boots skidding on the ice-slicked pavement, throwing themselves into the shadows of a discarded cart. The wheel had seized to the axle, a solid block of rusted iron that offered no cover, only a suggestion of it. Bentley pressed his spine against the soot-stained brick of the chute, the cold seeping through the wool instantly, biting into his shoulder blades. He raised the Webley. The metal felt alien, a dead weight that refused to warm to his grip. Nothing happened. No flash, no roar, no bullet chewing the brickwork above his head. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressing against their eardrums until they rang. It was not the quiet of an empty street. It was the silence of a held breath, a city-wide flinch. Petticoat Lane, usually a cacophony of bartering voices, clattering hooves, and the shriek of costermongers hawking kippers and oranges, had been vacated. The stalls stood empty, canvas awnings fluttering listlessly in the draught, displaying piles of rotting cabbages and frozen fish that no one dared to buy. The usual throng of shoppers, the women with baskets on their arms and the men in flat caps, had evaporated. They had sensed the shift in the air, the specific static that precedes violence, and fled into the warrens of the tenements, leaving the street to the hunters and the hunted. Bentley kept his eyes fixed on the gateway 50 yards away. The wrought iron gate still swung, a slow, rhythmic squeak of unoiled hinges that cut through the stillness. Squeak, pause, squeak. It marked time in a place where time seemed to have stopped. "Did you see him?" Miller whispered. His voice was too loud, a jagged tear in the fabric of the quiet. He crouched behind the cart's wheel, his revolver pointed at nothing in particular, the barrel dipping as his hand trembled. "No," Bentley said, though he did not look at Miller, for to look away from the gate was to invite death. Just the sound, the bolt. Bolt, Holloway shifted, his coat rustling like dry leaves. Could be a door, just a door shutting. Doors don't sound like that, Bentley said. That was a rifle or a Mauser, someone was ready. He risked a glance upward. The third-floor window remained a dark, hollow eye. The shadow was gone, absorbed by the gloom of the room inside. If a man stood there now, holding a weapon trained on the street, Bentley would not know until the lead arrived. That was the terror of it. The enemy was invisible, a ghost in the machine of the city, while the police were painted in bright blue and black, conspicuous targets moving in the open. A horse whinnied somewhere far off, a lonely, distressed sound that echoed down the lane, then cut off abruptly. Even the animals knew to keep their heads down. Bentley checked his revolver again. The cylinder felt stiff, the frost having settled into the mechanism during the long stakeout. He thumbed the hammer back, just a fraction, testing the tension. It resisted, then snapped forward with a gritty reluctance. He needed oil. He needed warmth. He needed men who knew which end of the gun the bullet came from, but all he had were 2 frightened detectives and the ghosts of 3 good men who had bled out on these same stones 3 weeks prior. Tucker, Choate, Woodhams. The names rolled through his mind, an automatic roll call that happened every time the noise stopped. 3 empty spaces in the formation, 3 voices that would never answer again. He could almost hear Tucker's dry cough, the way he used to clear his throat before making a joke about the commissioner's hat. Now, there was only the wind whistling through the gaps in the mortar. Sarge, Miller hissed, "The gate, it's moving more." Bentley looked. The wind had picked up, or perhaps someone on the other side had nudged it. The gate swung wider, revealing a sliver of the courtyard beyond. It was a pit of shadows, piled high with refuse and broken crates. Nothing moved within it. Yet the feeling of being watched intensified, a physical pressure between his shoulder blades, as if 1,000 eyes were boring into him from the surrounding windows. "They're letting us wait," Bentley said. "They want us to freeze, want us to make a mistake." "So we go in?" Holloway asked. His voice cracked on the last word. "We hold," Bentley said. "We don't give them the angle." "Hold for what?" Miller's frustration leaked through, sharp and jagged. "The Met Patrol was supposed to be here 10 minutes ago. 10 minutes, Sarge. They're not coming." "They'll come." "They won't," Miller insisted, shifting his weight, the ice crunching under his boot. "This is their patch. They let us cross the line, they let us do the dirty work, but they won't bleed for it, not for city men." Bentley said nothing. He knew Miller was right. The jurisdictional boundary was a line drawn in ink, easily erased when the shooting started. The Metropolitan Police would arrive when the bodies were cold, ready to claim the credit or assign the blame, whichever suited the headlines. Until then, they were alone in the cold, facing men who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. A gust of wind swept down the lane, carrying with it the smell of coal smoke and something else, something acrid and chemical, cordite, faint but unmistakable. It lingered near the gateway, drifting over the cobbles like a low-lying mist. They fired a test shot, Bentley realized, the thought landing with the weight of a stone, checking the wind, checking the freeze. "Or checking us," Holloway murmured. Bentley tightened his grip on the Webley. His fingers were numb, the gloves offering little protection against the biting chill that had seeped into the metal. He wondered if the firing pin would strike true if he pulled the trigger. Would the spring have enough force to punch the cap, or would the cold have turned his weapon into a club? The anarchists' Mausers, stolen from the continent, oiled and cared for by men who lived by the gun, would not fail. The disparity yawned between them, a chasm of competence and care. He thought of Tucker's revolver, lying in the gutter where he fell, the cylinder jammed fast by the frost and the blood. Tucker had died because the mechanism failed, because the cold had won. Bentley would not let it happen again. He shoved the revolver into his pocket, deciding to keep it warm against his body until the last possible second. Better to run with a bare hand than shoot with a frozen one. "Sarge," Miller said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "look at the stalls." Bentley followed his gaze. The empty market stalls, the silent awnings. Amongst the rotting produce, small movements caught his eye. Not rats, people, faces peering out from beneath the canvas, from behind piles of crates. The locals, they hadn't all fled. They were watching, hidden in the shadows of their own livelihoods, eyes wide and dark, tracking the police movement with a mixture of fear and hatred. They knew who was in the tenement. They knew the men who had walked past their doors, speaking in tongues no one here understood, paying in gold for bread and silence. "They're shielding them," Bentley said, the realization tasting like ash. "The whole bloody street is shielding them." "Why?" Holloway asked, noting that they were anarchists who would burn this place down just as readily as anywhere else. "Because we're the law," Bentley said, the words bitter on his tongue, "for the law hasn't been kind to this end of the river. To them, we're just another gang with badges, maybe worse." The gate squeaked again, louder this time, deliberate. Bentley tensed, muscles coiling. He slipped his hand back into his pocket, wrapping his fingers around the warm grip of the Webley. The metal was still cold, but less so. The friction of his skin had raised the temperature a degree. Enough, perhaps. "Ready," he breathed, the word barely audible. Miller and Holloway adjusted their stances as their revolvers rose, stretching the silence until it was taut and trembling. The wind died, the flagging awnings stopped their flutter, and even the distant traffic seemed to hold its breath. Then a sound from the gateway, not a footstep, not a voice. The soft, distinct crunch of gravel under a boot. Someone was stepping out. Bentley held his breath, his finger resting lightly on the trigger, waiting for the shadow to resolve into a man, for the man to raise a gun, for the world to explode into noise and fire once more. He counted the seconds, 1, 2, 3, listening to the phantom roll call in his head, waiting for the names of the dead to be joined by the living. The shadow lengthened. A figure emerged from the darkness of the courtyard, silhouetted against the grey sky, tall, broad-shouldered, holding something long and dark in his hands. Bentley squeezed. The air inside the room tasted of stale tobacco and wet wool, a thick soup that clung to the back of the throat. Heat radiated from the cast-iron stove in the corner, pulsing in waves that distorted the view of the map pinned to the wall. Sergeant Robert Bentley stood by the window, his back to the fire, feeling the sweat prickle beneath his stiff collar. He did not remove his hat. To take it off would be to admit comfort, and comfort was a luxury the dead denied him. Superintendent Thorne sat behind the desk, a mountain of flesh encased in a uniform that strained at the buttons. He dipped a pen into an inkwell, the nib scratching against paper with a sound like insects crawling over bone. "You cannot authorize a raid on metropolitan territory without Home Office clearance, Bentley." Thorne did not look up. "Protocol exists for a reason." "Attempt 1. Protocol buried 3 men in Houndstitch," Bentley said, his voice low and roughened by coal smoke and lack of sleep. "They are in Sydney Street. We know the building, we know the faces." "Critique changed dialogue structure too much." Thorne blotted the paper, pressing the pad down with a thumb that left a greasy smear. "You know nothing. You have suspicion. You have hearsay from informants who drink away their wages. I have jurisdiction." Bentley pushed off the windowsill. The floorboards creaked under his weight. He walked to the desk, placing both hands on the polished wood. His knuckles were white, the skin cracked from the frost outside. He could smell the ink, sharp and chemical, mixing with the scent of Thorne's pomade. "Jurisdiction does not stop a bullet," Bentley said. "If they move, we lose them. If we wait for Churchill to sign a form, they will be in Latvia by Tuesday." "Then let them go." Thorne finally looked up, his eyes small and watery in the gaslight. "This is not your patch, Sergeant. You are city police. You step over the boundary line without written authorization, and you compromise the entire operation. Do you understand the political ramifications?" Bentley felt the pulse in his neck, a heavy throb against the starched linen. He thought of Tucker's body lying in the snow, the blood freezing before it could soak into the ground. He thought of the empty chairs in the mess hall. The roll call in his head stuttered, missing names that should have been there. Tucker, Choate, Woodhams. The silence of their absence was louder than Thorne's pedantic drone. "I understand that men are dying while you file paperwork," Bentley said. "Men die every day." Thorne capped his pen. The click was final. "It is our job to ensure the law survives them. Sit down, wait for the telegram." Bentley straightened. The heat from the stove pressed against his back, suffocating. He looked at the map on the wall, the red pins marking the known movements of the Latvian gang. They were clustered around Stepney, a tight knot of violence in the grey sprawl of the East End. He could trace the route in his sleep. He knew the alleys, the courtyards, the places where a man could vanish into the fog. "And if the telegram comes too late?" Bentley asked. "Then we file a report." Thorne reached for a file folder, pulling it towards him with a scrape of cardboard. "Go home, Sergeant. Get some rest. You look like a ghost." Bentley turned away. He walked to the door, his boots heavy on the floor. He paused with his hand on the brass knob, the metal cold against his palm. The contrast shocked him, a sharp bite after the oppressive warmth of the room. "I am not going home," Bentley said. Thorne sighed, a long exhalation of patience worn thin, before warning, "Do not force me to suspend you, Robert." He added that he had liked Robert's father and would hate to disgrace his memory. Bentley opened the door. The corridor outside was dark, the gas jets turned low to save expense. A draft swept through, carrying the smell of damp stone and urine from the cells below. It was cleaner than the room he left. "My father died in his bed," Bentley said. "I intend to die on my feet." He stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. The latch clicked, sealing Thorne inside with his papers and his safety. Bentley stood for a moment in the gloom, listening. Distant footsteps echoed on the stairs. A telephone bell rang somewhere in the bowels of the building, shrill and insistent, unanswered. He adjusted his collar. The fabric was stiff, stained with a ring of soot near the neck that no amount of scrubbing would remove. It rubbed against his skin, a constant reminder of the grime he waded through. He touched the Webley in his coat pocket, the metal cold and heavy. The cylinder turned smoothly when he tested it with his thumb, but he knew the damp outside would seize it soon enough. Metal contracted in the cold. Machines failed. Men failed. Only the will remained. Bentley walked towards the stairs, his pace quickening. He would not wait for the telegram. He would not wait for permission. The jurisdictional line was a fiction drawn on a map, invisible to the men bleeding in the snow. He would cross it. He would walk into the fog and find them. At the bottom of the stairs, he paused to light a cigarette. The match flared, brief and bright, illuminating the lines on his face before dying. He inhaled deeply, the smoke filling his lungs, masking the taste of the room above. He checked his watch. 10 minutes past 8. The fog would be thickening now, swallowing the streets, hiding movements. Perfect. He pushed open the exit door and stepped into the night. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. London stretched out before him, a landscape of shadows and gaslight. Somewhere out there, Peters was waiting. Somewhere out there, the ghosts were whispering. Bentley pulled his collar up and walked into the mist. He did not look back at the building behind him. There was nothing there for him now but paperwork and excuses. The street awaited. The hunt was on. The scratch of the nib stopped. Winston Churchill did not look up when the clerk entered, nor did he acknowledge the draft that slipped beneath the door of the Home Office, carrying with it the smell of wet coal and horse manure from the street below. He held his fountain pen suspended over the memorandum, the ink pooling at the tip, a perfect dark sphere waiting to fall. The room was warm, stiflingly so, heated by a coal fire that roared in the grate with an excess of fuel no constable on Sydney Street would see for a week. Here the cold was a theoretical concept, a meteorological nuisance reported in telegrams rather than a physical weight crushing the lungs. "Sir," the clerk said, shifting the weight of a stack of papers in his arms, "the Metropolitan Commissioner is on the line again. He insists on waiting for the guards." Churchill dipped the pen. The nib kissed the paper, leaving a trail of black that cut through the white space with surgical precision. "Let him wait." "He says the men are freezing, sir. Morale is, sir." "Morale is a matter of leadership, not temperature." Churchill's voice was flat, devoid of the cadence of comfort. He wrote authorized with a sharp flick of the wrist, the loop of the day closing tight like a noose. "If the police cannot secure the premises, then the police are inadequate. If they are inadequate, the state must provide the muscle. It is simple arithmetic." The clerk hesitated, the papers rustling as he adjusted his grip. "And the fire brigade, sir, they are standing by in Commercial Road. should I tell them to move up? Churchill paused. He lifted his head finally, his eyes bright and unblinking behind his spectacles, reflecting the gaslight rather than the gloom of the January afternoon. He looked at the map spread across the desk, a topographical abstraction of the East End where streets were lines and buildings were blocks, devoid of the people huddled inside them. The tenement at 100 Sydney Street was marked with a red cross, a target rather than a home. No, Churchill said. He returned his gaze to the paper, adding a postscript about the deployment of the Scots Guards, the handwriting flowing smoothly, untouched by the tremor of doubt. Hold the fire engines back. If the villains choose to burn, let them burn. We shall not risk good men to save those who have declared war on the law. He blew gently on the wet ink, a small human gesture that sent a puff of air across the page, accelerating the drying process. The document was a command to escalate, to bring the heavy machinery of the Empire down upon a single room in a slum, yet it read like a dinner invitation, polite and firm. He handed it to the clerk without looking at him again. Send it, and tell the commissioner I expect results before dusk. The clerk took the paper, bowing slightly, and retreated. The door clicked shut, sealing the warmth back inside. Churchill stood and walked to the window, pressing a hand against the cold glass. Far to the east, a smudge of grey smoke hung low over the city, invisible from this distance, swallowed by the greater fog. He imagined the scene there, the shivering constables, the terrified neighbours, the anarchists with their Mausers. He felt nothing but a cool, intellectual satisfaction. The narrative was taking shape. The state would demonstrate its invincibility. The details of the bloodshed were merely footnotes to the headline. Attempt 1. He turned back to the desk, picking up another file. While the cold outside did not matter, nor did the cold inside the men who served him, only the outcome mattered. Critique 1, too condensed, loses the punch of the individual thoughts. Miles away, the ink was still wet on the order, but the heat of the fire had not yet reached the street. Bentley stood in the shadow of a butcher's shop, the smell of old blood and sawdust clinging to his coat, heavier than the cordite that haunted his dreams. His boots scraped against the frozen pavement, the sound too loud in the unnatural quiet of the evacuated zone. He had left the formal cordon 2 streets back, slipping past the metropolitan inspectors who were still arguing over jurisdiction, their breath pluming in white clouds as they shouted about protocols and chains of command. Protocols, the word tasted like ash. Tucker didn't have protocols when the Mauser rounds hit him. Choate didn't have a chain of command when he bled out on the cobblestones. Bentley adjusted his scarf, pulling the wool tight against his neck, but the cold found the gaps anyway. It bit at his ears, numbed his fingers inside his gloves. He checked his Webley again, the metal so cold it burned his palm. He shoved the revolver inside his coat, pressing it against his waistcoat, ignoring the regulation that forbade warming firearms against the body. Let the inspectors complain. A jammed gun was a death sentence. A warm gun was a chance. Total content, points to preserve. 1. He moved along the tenement wall. 2. He kept low. 3. His eyes scanned the windows. 4. The building loomed above him. 5. It was like a jagged tooth of brick. 6. Against the grey sky. 7. Every window was dark. 8. Glass opaque with frost. 9. Hiding movement within. 10. He counted them. 11. Count, 1, 2, 3, 4 ground floor, 6 above. Current rhythm issue, the end is very staccato, he counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4 on the ground floor, 6 above. This violates the nevermore. 7. He stopped. The third-floor window, the one Halloway had spotted, was different. The frost pattern there was disturbed, a clear patch in the center where breath or heat had melted the ice from the inside. Someone was there, watching, waiting. Bentley pressed his back against the rough brickwork, feeling the vibration of a distant cart rumbling over the frozen ground, the only sound in a street that felt like a tomb. He pulled a notebook from his pocket, the pages stiff with cold, and sketched a quick diagram of the far A tilde section Adair. Exit points, weak spots, the angle of fire from the rooftop. If he could just get a message to the yard, tell them the layout, maybe they would move. Maybe Churchill would stop writing memos and start sending men. but the telegraph lines were down, or busy, or ignored. The bureaucracy was a wall higher than the tenement itself. A gust of wind swept down the alley, carrying a swirl of snow that strung his exposed skin. Bentley flinched, wiping his eyes with a gloved hand. When he looked up, the clear patch in the window had changed. A shape had formed behind the glass. Not a shadow this time, but a silhouette, broad shoulders, a head tilted slightly as if listening. Bentley froze, his breath caught in his throat, a sharp pain in his chest. He raised his hand, signaling to the empty street, a reflexive gesture to men who weren't there. He was alone. The Metropolitan Patrol was still arguing 3 streets away. Miller and Holloway were watching the back gate, likely freezing to death while he played detective in the front. The silhouette shifted, an arm rose. Bentley dropped to one knee, the action clumsy as his stiff trousers resisted the movement. He drew the Webley from his coat, the metal warmer now, slick with the moisture of his body. He aimed at the window, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "Come out," he whispered, the words snatched away by the wind. "It's over." The figure did not move. The arm remained raised, steady, unwavering. Then, a flash. A puff of smoke bloomed from the window, instantly gray against the gray sky. The crack of the shot was deafening, echoing off the narrow street like a hammer striking an anvil. Something whined past Bentley's ear, close enough to feel the displacement of air. He rolled sideways, scraping his shoulder against the brick, and returned fire instinctively. The Webley bucked in his hand, the report joining the cacophony. "Police, throw down your arms," he shouted, though he knew it was futile. Another shot rang out from the window, then another, rapid, precise. The glass in the window shattered, raining shards onto the pavement below with a sound like breaking ice. Bentley pressed himself flat against the wall, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was exposed, trapped in the open with a man who had nothing to lose. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A constable from the Met cordon, drawn by the gunfire, was running towards him, his helmet bobbing, his face a mask of confusion and fear. "Get down," Bentley screamed. Too late. A third shot cracked through the air. The running constable jerked as if punched, a dark stain blooming instantly on his tunic shoulder. He stumbled, his legs tangling, and fell hard onto the frozen ground, a cry of pain tearing from his lips. Bentley scrambled forward, dragging the wounded man behind the cover of a water trough. The blood was bright red against the white snow, steaming in the cold air. The constable gasped, clutching his shoulder, his eyes wide with shock. "Bastards," the constable wheezed, his teeth chattering. "They just shot me." "Stay still," Bentley growled as he pressed a handkerchief against the wound, the fabric soaking through instantly. "Don't move." He looked up, peering over the edge of the trough. The window was dark again, the silhouette gone. But then, slowly, a figure stepped back into the frame, not hiding, not fleeing. J.A. Umlaut Cabs Peters stood in the broken window, the light from the room behind him casting his features in stark relief. He held a pistol in one hand, resting casually against the sill. He did not speak. He did not gesture. He simply looked down at Bentley, at the wounded man, at the blood on the snow, with an expression of absolute, terrifying calm. He was daring them, daring the state to come and take him. Bentley felt a surge of rage, so hot it momentarily banished the cold. He tightened his grip on the Webley, the metal biting into his palm. The roll call in his head screamed Agena Tucker, Choate, Woodhampshire demanding an answer, demanding blood. "Hold the line," Bentley muttered, more to himself than to the groaning constable. "Nobody leaves this street alive." Above them, the smoke from the muzzle drifted lazily upward, merging with the fog, as the first real battle of Sydney Street began. "Hold the lines." The words hung in the frost, brittle and useless. Bentley pressed the handkerchief harder against the constable's shoulder, feeling the wet warmth seep through the wool of his glove, a shocking intimacy in the freezing air. The boy, he couldn't have been more than 20, with a face still soft beneath the helmet Rima whimpered, a small animal sound that cut through the wind sharper than any bullet. "Quiet," Bentley snapped, though his voice lacked its usual iron. "Save it." He looked up. The window above was empty now, the silhouette of Peters withdrawn into the gloom of the tenement, leaving only the jagged teeth of broken glass to mark his presence. The shot had been clean, professional, a statement written in lead and blood on the white pavement. Then came the sound of marching. Not the scuff of police boots on cobblestones, nor the hurried slap of metropolitan heels chasing a lead. This was different, rhythmic, heavy, a synchronized thud that vibrated through the soles of Bentley's boots and traveled up his shins, settling in his knees like a dull ache. Around the corner of Sydney Street they came, the Scots Guards. They moved with a terrifying precision that made the chaotic huddle of city and metropolitan police look like a rabble of drunkards. Scarlet tunics, vivid and obscene against the grey slush and the grime of the East End, burned in Bentley's vision. Gold buttons caught the weak, winter light, flashing like eyes. They did not look at the wounded constable. They did not look at Bentley, kneeling in the snow with his hands stained red. They looked straight ahead, their faces masks of imperial indifference, rifles held at the port with a casual elegance that spoke of drill squares and parades, not alleyway ambushes. A young officer, barely older than the boy bleeding at Bentley's feet, stepped forward. His beard was trimmed to a point, his cap pulled low against the wind. He surveyed the scene with a quick, clinical sweep of his eyes, lingering for a fraction of a second on the blood pooling in the snow before dismissing it. "Sergeant," the officer's voice was clipped, upper class, devoid of the gravel that lined Bentley's own throat. Bentley City Police. He didn't rise. To stand would be to acknowledge the hierarchy, to admit that this was no longer his hunt. One man down, shot from the upper window. Suspect is Peters, or one of his lot. The officer nodded, as if filing the information away in a ledger that mattered more than the life ebbing onto the pavement. "We have the perimeter. You'll fall back to the outer cordon, behind the vans." "I'm in charge of this investigation," Bentley said, the protest automatic, reflexive. "Not anymore." The officer turned, signaling to his men with a sharp jerk of his chin. "Take positions, cover the windows, do not fire unless fired upon. But if they show..." He let the sentence hang unfinished, the implication heavy in the cold air. The soldiers moved. They flowed into position with a fluidity that made Bentley's own limbs feel clumsy, frozen. They dropped to one knee, rifle butts shouldered, sights aligned. The mechanical click-clack of bolts sliding home echoed down the street, a chorus of steel on steel that sounded final, absolute. Bentley watched them, a sour taste rising in his mouth. He looked down at his own Webley resting in his lap. The metal was cold again, the warmth of his body stolen by the wind. He remembered the jam earlier, the cylinder refusing to turn, the sheer, stupid physics of oil turning to glue in the frost. He rubbed his thumb over the trigger guard, feeling the roughness of the steel. These men didn't have that problem. Their rifles were Lee Enfields, polished and oiled, maintained by armorers who didn't have to worry about the price of coal or the length of a shift. They were tools of the state, sharp and efficient. Bentley was just a man with a badge and a gun that froze in his pocket. "Move back, Sergeant." Without glancing his way, the officer kept his gaze fixed on the window, finger resting lightly beside the trigger guard. "We don't need civilians in the kill zone." Civilians, the word strung worse than the cold. Bentley had lost 3 men to these anarchists. Tucker, Choate, Woodhams. Their names were etched into his skull, a roll call that played on a loop whenever the silence stretched too thin. He wasn't a civilian. He was the one who had tracked them here, who had followed the trail of blood and fear through the frozen streets while the Home Office dithered and the Metropolitan Police argued over jurisdiction. But the Scarlet line held firm, a wall of red and gold between him and the tenement. He gripped the wounded constable under the arm. "Up you get." The boy groaned, his legs buckling as Bentley hauled him upright. Blood smeared across Bentley's coat, a dark, sticky streak that joined the soot and grease already grinding into the fabric. He could feel the heat of the boy's body leaching into his own, a fleeting connection in the freezing air. "Can you walk?" Bentley asked. "Dunno," the constable whispered. "Feels like fire." "Then walk on it." They stumbled back, away from the sharp line of the guards. Bentley kept his eyes on the tenement, on the dark square of the window where Peters had stood. He expected another shot, expected the glass to shatter again, a bullet to punch through the air and find them, but nothing happened. The building sat silent, brooding, a fortress of glass and ice that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Behind him, the guards shifted. Boots scraped on the frost. A rifle stock knocked against a brick wall. The sounds were sharp, distinct, cutting through the muffled quiet of the street. Bentley reached the line of police vans, the painted wood peeling and cracked by the weather. He leaned the constable against the wheel, the boy slumping immediately, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Stay there," Bentley ordered. "Don't move." He turned back to the siege. The police were being pushed further back, relegated to spectators in their own manhunt. A metropolitan inspector, face purple with cold and rage, was arguing with a guard lieutenant, gesturing wildly at the cordon. The lieutenant ignored him, pointing instead at the roof of the tenement, where two soldiers were already climbing a drainpipe, moving with the agility of spiders. Bentley shoved his hands into his pockets, his fingers curling around the grip of his Webley. The metal was ice-cold, biting into his palm. He should warm it, press it against his ribs, under the coat, let the body heat loosen the oil. The regulations said otherwise. Firearms must be kept away from the body to prevent warming, to maintain readiness, but the regulations hadn't accounted for 26 degrees of frost. The regulations hadn't accounted for Tucker lying in a mortuary with a hole in his head because a cylinder wouldn't turn. He ignored the rule. He pressed the revolver against his stomach, feeling the chill seep through his waistcoat, waiting for the slow, agonizing transfer of warmth. "Madness," someone muttered beside him. "Attempt 1. Bentley turned. It was Miller, whose face was gray and whose eyes remained fixed on the Scarlet line. "They're going to shoot the place up, bring the whole bloody block down." Critique 1, Bentley turned, is short. It was Miller, is long. Dialogue has 2 short sentences. That's 2 short sentences in a row at the end. Need to vary. "Maybe that's the plan," Bentley said. His voice was flat, devoid of hope. "Churchill's up the road," Miller added, jerking his thumb towards Commercial Road. "Saw the car, he's watching." "Of course he is." Bentley looked back at the tenement, where the silence was absolute now, with no wind and no distant traffic, just the creak of frozen timber and the low murmur of soldiers adjusting their positions. It was a held breath, a pause before the plunge. He counted the seconds, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The rhythm felt familiar, too familiar. It was the same count he used at roll call, waiting for the names that would never be answered. Tucker, pause, Choate, pause, Woodhams, pause. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Then a flicker. Down on the ground floor, behind the boarded-up window of the corner shop, a light appeared. Not the steady, yellow glow of gas or electric. This was erratic, dancing, orange and deep red, swirling like oil on water. It cast long, distorted shadows against the boards, shadows that grew and shrank with a frantic, living energy. Bentley squinted, his breath catching. The light intensified, pulsing faster, casting a warm, hellish reflection on the snow at his feet. "Miller," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Look." Miller followed his gaze, the color drained from his already pale face. "Is that?" "Fire," Bentley said. The orange glow spread, licking at the edges of the boards, turning the wood black. Smoke began to curl out from the cracks, thin and gray at first, then thickening, darkening, rising to join the low-hanging fog. The smell hit them a moment later, acrid, choking, the scent of burning pitch and old timber. The guards didn't move. They held their positions, rifles steady, watching the fire as if it were part of the drill. Bentley felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, colder than the frost, colder than the steel in his pocket. This wasn't a siege anymore, it was a cremation. And inside, Peters was still silent. The crack of the rifle shot died instantly, swallowed by the frost before it could echo off the brickwork. Silence rushed back in, not the quiet of a sleeping street, nor the hush of a church at prayer, but a vacuum, a physical absence of sound so complete it pressed against the eardrums like deep water. The usual grind of cart wheels on cobbles, the distant whistle of the gasworks, the murmur of the market traders packing up against the colder, all of it had been scrubbed from the air. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, holding its breath as if terrified of drawing the attention of the men inside number 100. Bentley stood motionless behind the water cart, the wood rough and splintered against his shoulder, while his eyes fixed on the dark rectangle of the ground floor window. He waited. 1, 2, 3. The count started in his chest, a reflexive thumping that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with habit. It was the rhythm of the parade ground, the metronome of the morning roll call when the fog rolled off the Thames, and the names had to be spoken aloud to prove the men still existed. Tucker, pause, Choate, pause, Woodhams, pause. The gaps between the names were where the ghosts lived, in those suspended seconds where no answer came. 4, 5, 6. Nothing, just the creak of frozen timber settling in the tenement, a sound like a bone snapping deep within a wall. The Scots Guards remained statues in their scarlet tunics, the bright wool absurdly vivid against the monochrome grey of the street. They did not shift. They did not cough. They simply aimed, their breathing so shallow it produced no visible steam, waiting for a target that refused to show itself. 7, 8. Bentley's fingers curled inside his gloves, the leather stiff and unyielding. He tried to flex them, to feel the blood moving in the knuckles, but the cold had seeped past the skin, past the muscle, settling into the marrow. It was a mechanical cold, the kind that seized latches and froze oil in hinges, turning living things into brittle machinery. He remembered the feel of his Webley earlier that morning, the cylinder refusing to turn, the metal stubborn as a locked door, until the friction of his desperate hands had warmed it enough to move. 9, 10. A bird landed on the lamppost opposite, a small grey sparrow shaking its feathers against the chill. It opened its beak to sing, a tiny, instinctive burst of life, and then stopped. Perhaps it sensed the danger. Perhaps the silence was too heavy even for a bird. It flew off, a sudden blur of wings that seemed loud as a gunshot in the stillness. 11, 12. "Why don't they speak?" Miller whispered, crouched beside Bentley with a pale face as his eyes darted between the windows and the scarlet line of soldiers. Surely they must say something. They could shout terms or demand a boat, doing anything at all. "They are counting too," Bentley said. His voice sounded flat, deadened by the air. "Counting what?" "Seconds, like us. 13, 14. The rhythm broke. A sharp crack split the air, distinct and high-pitched, coming from the upper floor. A sniper's rifle, or perhaps a Mauser pistol, fired from a rest. The bullet struck the brickwork inches from a guard's head, sending a spray of red dust and mortar chips into the snow. The soldier did not flinch. He did not even blink. He simply adjusted his aim 2 inches to the left, his movement fluid and precise, and fired back. The return shot was louder, a heavy thud that vibrated in Bentley's chest. Glass shattered somewhere inside the building, a cascading crash that sounded like ice breaking on a pond. Then, silence again. The vacuum sealed itself over the wound. 15, 16. Bentley found himself holding his breath, his lungs burning with the need to exhale. He forced the air out, a slow, shuddering stream that misted in front of his face. The cold bit at his cheeks, stinging the skin where the stubble had grown thick over the last 2 days. He had not shaved since Houndstitch. The razor felt like a luxury from another life, a triviality belonging to a world where men died in beds and not in gutters with their pockets full of stolen watches. 17, 18. The snow began to fall again, small, dry flakes that drifted down without wind, settling on the shoulders of the dead constable, on the barrels of the rifles, on the upturned faces of the crowd gathering at the edge of the cordon. The people stood behind the police line, bundled in shawls and coats, their faces grey and drawn. They watched with a terrible fascination, like mourners at a hanging. No one spoke. No one cried out. The entire street had become a tomb, and they were all waiting for the earth to close over the occupants. 19, 20. "It's wrong," Miller muttered. He rubbed his hands together, the friction making a dry, rasping sound. "It feels wrong, like we're waiting for a train that isn't coming." "The train came," Bentley said. "We just missed it." 21, 22. He watched the window. The darkness inside seemed to have depth, a physical weight that pulled at the eye. There was no movement, no shadow passing across the glass, just the stillness of men who had made their choice and were now enduring the consequences. Bentley thought of Peters, a name that existed only in files and whispers, a ghost who moved through walls and left no footprints. Was he in there, counting the seconds, listening to the creak of the ice and the breathing of the soldiers? 23, 24. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, a lonely, yelping sound that echoed down the alleyway. It was cut short, as if a hand had clamped over its muzzle. The silence returned, heavier than before. It pressed down on Bentley's shoulders, forcing him to hunch, to make himself smaller against the weight of it. He thought of the roll call again, the empty spaces where the names should be. Tucker, the silence, Choate, the silence, Woodhams, the silence. The gaps were getting longer. The pauses were stretching out, filling with more than just air. They were filling with the cold, with the snow, with the knowledge that some questions never received an answer. 25, 26. The creaking stopped. The settling of the building ceased. Even the snow seemed to hang suspended in the air, refusing to fall. Bentley's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, bird-like rhythm that clashed with the slow count in his head. He wanted to shout, to break the silence with a voice, with a command, with anything that sounded like life. But his throat was closed, frozen shut by the same frost that gripped the street. 27, 28. Then a change, a shift in the quality of the light. It started as a flicker, a faint orange pulse deep within the blackness of the ground floor window. It was not the flash of a gun, nor the steady glow of a gas jet. It was erratic, dancing, growing stronger with every passing second. The light licked at the edges of the boarded-up frame, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed against the interior walls like living things. 29, 30. The smell hit them a moment later, acrid, choking, the scent of burning pitch and dry timber, sharp and oily, cutting through the clean cold of the winter air. Smoke began to curl out from the cracks in the boards, thin and grey at first, then thickening, darkening, rising to join the low-hanging fog. Bentley stopped counting. The rhythm was broken. The roll call was over. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "look." The soldier turned. The scarlet tunic seemed to glow in the reflected light. He watched the window, his face unreadable, as the orange flames grew brighter, feeding on something unseen, turning the tenement into a furnace. The silence was gone now, replaced by the crackle of the fire, a hungry, devouring sound that drowned out everything else. The siege had ended, the cremation had begun, and inside, the ghosts were finally warm. The inspector's voice cracked, dry as old parchment. He stood behind the line of vans, sheltering in the shadow of a horse-drawn water cart that had frozen solid mid-pump. Ice glazed the wheels, locking them to the cobblestones. No one volunteered. The scarlet tunics of the guards held their rifles steady, eyes fixed on the tenement windows, ignoring the police entirely. This was their show now. The city force stood relegated to the wings, props in a military drama. Bentley shifted his weight. The cold had seeped through the soles of his boots, numbing his toes until they felt like blocks of wood stuffed into his socks. He needed to move. Standing still invited the frost to bite deeper, to claim the joints next. "I'll take it," Miller said. He stepped out from the line. A white handkerchief hung from his grip, stark against the grey day. It was not a flag of truce so much as a rag of surrender, limp and unimpressive in the windless air. Bentley grabbed his arm. The wool of Miller's sleeve was damp, chilled by the fog. "Don't," Bentley said. "Someone has to ask." Miller pulled free. "Can't just burn them out without a word. Not here, not London." "There's no one to ask. Regulations say we offer terms." Miller's jaw tightened as a muscle jumped beneath the grime on his cheek. "I'm doing my duty, Sarge, same as you." He walked away before Bentley could find the words to stop him, and as the snow crunched under his boots, the sound rang too loud for the empty street, each step a betrayal of position. Bentley watched him go while counting the paces. 1, 2, 3 came next, then 4 followed by 5. This rhythm matched the roll call in his head where phantom voices rose to meet each step. Tucker. Miller walked. Choate. When Miller stopped, the name Woodham surfaced just as Miller raised the handkerchief. 10 yards, 15. The distance between the cordon and the tenement door yawned like a grave. "Hold!" a guard lieutenant shouted from the roofline. His voice carried, sharp and authoritative, cutting across the frozen ground. "Target is exposed." "He's police," Bentley roared. The sound tore at his throat, raw and useless. The lieutenant did not look down. He kept his rifle shouldered, cheek pressed to the stock, eye aligned with the sights. To him, Miller was not a constable. He was a variable in the equation of the siege, a moving shape in the kill zone. Miller reached the center of the street. He waved the cloth. The fabric fluttered, a weak pulse against the static brickwork of the building. He opened his mouth. Bentley could not hear the words, but he saw the shape of them. "Come out, surrender, law." Nothing moved inside the tenement. The windows remained dark, boarded eyes refusing to blink. The silence held, heavy and waiting. Then the world snapped. A crash from the ground floor window, not glass shattering this time, but wood splintering as the board gave way. The muzzle of a Mauser flashed, a brief yellow star in the gloom. Miller jerked. The handkerchief flew from his hand, spun by the wind of the bullet passing through his coat. He did not scream. He folded, knees hitting the snow first, then his shoulder, then the rest of him collapsing into a heap. The white cloth landed beside him. It did not stay white for long. A dark stain bloomed across the fabric, spreading fast, soaking into the snow beneath. "Miller!" Bentley moved before he thought. His legs drove him forward, boots slipping on the ice. A hand grabbed his collar, yanking him back with brutal force. He stumbled, flailing, and found himself facing the guard lieutenant. The soldier's rifle was pointed at the ground, but his grip was iron. "Stay down," the lieutenant said, his voice flat and devoid of malice or mercy. "You go out there, you die. Simple." "He's bleeding," Bentley said, and when he tried to shove past, the soldier did not move, standing instead as a wall of scarlet wool and discipline. "He's dead," the lieutenant corrected. "Look at the snow." Bentley looked. The red around Miller was too dark, too wide. It steamed slightly in the cold air, a brief ghost of heat rising from the body before the frost claimed it. The handkerchief lay sodden, weighted down by the blood, pinned to the ground by the freezing wet. The realization hit Bentley not as a shock, but as a settling, a finality. There would be no negotiation, there would be no trial. The men inside did not want terms, they wanted the end. "Pull back," the inspector shouted from the vans. "Get the line back, they're shooting." The police scrambled. Boots slipped on the ice. Men cursed, dragging themselves behind the cover of the vans and the water cart. The guards did not move. They remained in their positions, rifles tracking the windows, waiting for the next flash. Bentley stood where he was, held by the lieutenant's grip until the soldier released him. He walked back to the line, his legs heavy. The cold had returned, sharper now, biting at the exposed skin of his neck. He could smell the cordite, sharp and metallic, mixing with the scent of wet wool and blood. It was the smell of houndstitch, the same smell, the same result. Miller lay still. No one went to fetch him. The street was too hot. "He wanted to do his duty," Bentley said. He spoke to the ground, to the frozen mud clinging to his boots. "Duty," the lieutenant repeated. He adjusted his rifle sling, the leather creaking. He walked into the line of fire. "That is not duty, that is suicide. It's the only way we know." "Then you are fools." The lieutenant turned away, his gaze drifting back to the tenement as he spoke the final words. "We finish this, no more flags." Bentley watched the building. The window where the shot came from remained dark. No victory shout, no taunt, just the silence returning, heavier than before. The snow began to fall again, light flakes drifting down to cover Miller's coat, to hide the red stain beneath a fresh layer of white. It was a poor shroud. He reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed the Webley. The metal was warm now, heated by his body, but the air around him was freezing. He could feel the cold radiating off the building, a physical weight pressing against his chest. "They won't come out," Bentley said. "No," the lieutenant agreed. "They won't." Bentley looked at the ground floor window where the boards were splintered, and through the gap, something flickered. It was not the flash of a gun, but something slower, deeper, a glow that pulsed against the dark interior, casting long shadows that danced against the remaining wood. He squinted. The light grew brighter, feeding on something unseen. "Lieutenant," Bentley said. His voice was low, barely audible over the wind picking up in the alley. The soldier did not turn. "What?" "Look at the window." The lieutenant followed his gaze. The glow intensified, orange licking at the edges of the splintered wood. Smoke began to curl out, thick and black, rising to meet the falling snow. The heat hit them a second later, a wave of dry, choking air that smelled of pitch and old timber. The siege was over. The cremation had begun. The chief froze, one hand still gripping the brass nozzle of the hose, the leather cold enough to strip skin. He did not turn immediately. The command had come from the corner, sharp and clipped, cutting through the crackle of the burning timber and the low murmur of the press pack. "I said stand down," Churchill repeated. He stepped forward, the toe of his polished boot crunching on a patch of black ice that had formed near the gutter. "No water touches that wall until I give the word." The fire chief turned slowly, his face a map of confusion and professional outrage. Smoke curled around his helmet, staining the white plume gray. "Sir, the structure is compromised. If we do not dampen the joists, the whole far A section Adair will come into the street. My men could be killed." "Your men are safe behind the cordon." Churchill took another draw from his cigar, the ember glowing bright orange against the gloom of the afternoon. He exhaled a thick stream of blue smoke that mixed with the acrid fumes rising from the tenement, blurring the line between the man and the disaster he was managing. "The danger lies within. If you extinguish the fire now, they will rush the exits. They will shoot their way through your lines. Do you wish to be responsible for the deaths of my constables, Chief? Do you wish to explain to the widows why you gave the anarchists a clear path?" "It is not a tactical decision," the chief snapped, his voice cracking under the strain. "It is a fire, it spreads, look at the heat." He gestured towards the building, where the windows had become mouths screaming light into the frozen street. The glass had long since shattered, leaving jagged teeth in the frames that glittered as the flames licked outward. The sound was no longer crackle but a roar, a physical force that pushed against the crowd, forcing them to lean back, to shield their faces with raised arms and turned collars. "I am making the tactical decision," Churchill said. His tone dropped, losing the public boom and becoming something harder, colder, like the iron of a cell door slamming shut. "You will hold your water. You will let the fire do the work it was sent to do. When the roof falls, when the floors collapse, then you may wet the rubble. Until then, you stand idle." The chief opened his mouth, a protest forming on his lips, but he saw the set of the Home Secretary's jaw. He saw the eyes, bright and unblinking, fixed not on the suffering inside the building, but on the political necessity of the moment. The argument died in his throat, strangled by the weight of authority. He looked at his men, who were watching him with wide, fearful eyes, hoses limp in their hands, useless as garden twine. "Drop the pressure," the chief muttered, the words tasting like ash, before he signaled to the engineer at the pump to cut the flow and hold the line. The engine's whine dipped, then settled into an idle chug. The tension in the hoses slackened. The water that should have been screaming onto the flames sat stagnant in the belly of the truck, heavy and silent. Churchill nodded, satisfied. He turned his back on the fire, adjusting the cuff of his glove with a precise, fastidious movement. There was no soot on the white wool, no grease from the machinery. He stood in the center of the chaos, a figure of immaculate order, while the world burned around him. He checked his pocket watch, the gold case flashing in the firelight, noting the time as if marking the end of a meeting rather than the sentencing of men to death. "See that the press understands," he said to his secretary, who hovered nearby with a notebook clutched to his chest. "We are containing the threat. We are not burning men alive. We are denying them the opportunity to murder again. Frame it thus." "Yes, sir," the secretary whispered, scribbling frantically, his pen scratching against the paper like a rat in the walls. 30 yards away, Bentley watched the exchange. He did not need to hear the words to know their shape. He saw the slump of the fire chief's shoulders, the way the man kicked at the frozen mud in frustration. He saw the hoses go limp, the canvas sagging like dead skin. He saw Churchill turn away, pristine and untouchable, while the heat from the building washed over the street, carrying the smell of roasting meat and burning hair. Bentley's hand drifted to his collar. The fabric was stiff with grime, soaked in the sweat of the chase and the soot of the alleys. It rubbed against his neck, raw and abrasive. He could feel the heat on his face, blistering and intense, but his insides felt hollow, filled with a cold that no fire could reach. He thought of Tucker, of Choate and Woodhams, lying in the mortuary with sheets pulled up to their chins. They had died for the law. They had died believing that the law was a shield, a thing that protected the innocent and restrained the guilty. Now the law was standing on the corner, smoking a cigar, letting the fire do the killing. "Sir," the lieutenant beside him shifted his weight, his rifle butt thumping softly against the ice. He was young, his face pale beneath the layer of cold dust. "They're holding the water back. Why are they holding the water back?" Bentley did not answer immediately. He watched a spark land on the snow near his boot, hissing as it died. He watched the flames climb higher, devouring the curtains, the furniture, the lives of men who had chosen to fight rather than yield. He thought of the Webley in his holster, the cylinder stiff with cold, the bullets that might never be fired because the state had found a quicker way. "Because it is easier," Bentley said finally. His voice was low, rough, barely audible over the roar of the inferno. "It is easier to let them burn than to drag them out, easier to call it justice than to call it murder." The lieutenant stared at him, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. "But they're men, Sergeant. They're burning alive." "They are anarchists," Bentley corrected, though the word felt hollow in his mouth, stripped of meaning by the sight of the fire. "And we are the police. We do what we are told." He looked back at Churchill. The Home Secretary was speaking now to a group of reporters, gesturing towards the building with a gloved hand, his expression grave and determined. He was spinning the narrative, turning the slaughter into a spectacle of strength, a triumph of the will. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment for the morning papers, freezing the image of the man who had tamed the East End with a single order. Bentley turned away. He could not watch anymore. The heat was too much, the smell too thick. He felt the soot on his collar burn against his skin, a brand marking him as complicit. He was no longer the hunter. He was merely the mechanic of the machine, standing by while it ground flesh into ash. "Keep the line tight," he ordered the lieutenant, his voice flat. "No one goes near the walls. When it comes down, it will come down fast." "Yes, sir." The lieutenant raised his rifle again, aiming at nothing, at the fire, at the ghost of the enemy. The crowd behind them fell silent, held in the grip of the spectacle, watching the building breathe fire into the sky. Churchill finished his statement and turned towards the armored car, his shadow stretching long across the pavement, reaching out to touch the toes of the nearest constable. He did not look at Bentley. He did not look at the fire brigade. He looked straight ahead, his gaze fixed on a point far beyond the burning tenement, where the victory was already won, clean and bloodless. Inside the building, a heavy beam gave way. The sound was like a cannon shot, a deep, resonant crack that echoed through the street. The roof sagged, the tiles sliding off to crash onto the street below, shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. A shower of sparks erupted upward, joining the falling snow in a chaotic dance of light and dark, illuminating the faces of the crowd in a hellish, flickering glow. The fire roared louder, hungry now, fed by the fresh oxygen rushing into the collapsing structure. It was no longer a containment. It was a cremation. Bentley closed his eyes for a second, just a second, and listened. Beneath the roar of the flames, beneath the shouts of the crowd and the idle chug of the fire engine, he heard nothing. No screams, no pleas, just the silence of the dead, waiting for the roll call that would never be answered. The roof groaned again, a final structural scream that vibrated in the chest, in the teeth, in the bone. The tension in the air snapped tight. "Ready yourselves," Bentley whispered. The end was coming, and there was no water to stop it. It hit the cordon like a physical blow, a wall of solid pressure that forced Bentley's boots to skid backward on the slick pavement. The snow did not melt. It evaporated, vanishing in a hiss of white steam that rose to meet the black smoke pouring from the upper windows of number 100. The air tasted of burnt wool and something sweeter, cloying, like meat left too long in a pantry. Pitch, old varnish, human hair. the smell of a house being digested by its own bones. Bentley raised a gloved hand to shield his eyes, though the glare was not from the sun. The fire had breached the roof. Flames licked out through the shattered sash windows, twisting in the wind, dancing a frantic jig that mocked the stillness of the men watching. They were orange tongues, greedy and fast, consuming the Latvian hideout with a speed that defied the freezing damp of the January afternoon. "Back," Bentley roared, his throat felt lined with ash. "Give it room." The line wavered. Constables stumbled over the frozen slush, their faces turned away, eyes watering against the assault of heat. The cold, that relentless antagonist that had seized their revolvers and stiffened their uniforms for weeks, retreated before this new fury. Ice on the cobblestones turned to water, then to mud, a black broth of soot and runoff that soaked through the leather of Bentley's boots. He could feel the wetness seeping in, cold and filthy, but his shins burned. The radiation was intense enough to blister paint, let alone skin. A chunk of plaster crashed onto the street 10 yards ahead, exploding into a cloud of white dust that mingled with the gray snow. As the building groaned, a deep structural complaint vibrated through the soles of Bentley's feet. It sounded like a dying animal, a low moan that rose in pitch while the timber gave way. Inside, the world was collapsing. Floors dropped. Walls bowed. The anarchists were in there, Peters, Svars, and Sokolov. These were men who had shot Tucker in the back, who had blown Choate's brains out in a hallway no wider than a coffin. Bentley counted 1, 2, 3. Rhythm issue in original, sentences 3, 4, 5, 6, a very short staccato, all present, all accounted for, except the 3 who were not. They were never there. This violates the never more than 2. The heat surged again. Bentley staggered, grabbing the shoulder of the constable next to him to steady himself. The wool of the man's uniform was hot to the touch, radiating the temperature of an oven. "Sir," the constable gasped, pulling at his collar. "Christ, it's cooking us." "Hold," Bentley said. He did not let go of the man's shoulder. His grip tightened, fingers digging into the thick fabric. Nobody moves forward. Nobody plays the hero. He looked up at the third floor where the window frame was gone, consumed entirely to leave a gaping maw of fire. Through the inferno, shapes moved, not clear figures, but shadows thrown against the back wall, silhouettes of men thrashing, trapped by the very fortress they had built. There was no screaming. That was the thing that snagged in Bentley's mind, a hook caught in the flesh of his memory, for there should have been screaming. Men burning alive did not die silently. They shrieked, they begged, they pounded on the glass. But the roar of the fire drowned everything. It was a total sound, a vacuum that swallowed all other noise. The crackle of timber, the crash of masonry, the hiss of the melting snow, it formed a cacophony so complete it created its own silence, a void where human voice should be. Tucker hadn't screamed either, just a wet gurgle, a sound like water draining from a basin, and then nothing. Choate had gone without a sound, his head simply ceasing to exist as a coherent object. Woodhams had tried to speak, to call for his mother perhaps, or maybe just to curse the cold, but the blood had filled his lungs first. Now the anarchists joined them in the quiet. Bentley watched a shadow detach itself from the wall, stumbling towards the window. A hand reached out, fingers splayed against the heat, seeking purchase on the burning sill. The skin blackened instantly. The figure recoiled, falling back into the orange depths, swallowed by the light. No cry followed, just the shifting of debris, the settling of the dead weight into the ruins. It felt righteous. The thought arrived uninvited, sharp and cold amidst the heat. It felt like balance. The ledger so long out of kilter was finally leveling itself. 3 for 3, maybe 4. The fire did not care about warrants or jurisdiction or the rules of engagement that bound Bentley's hands. The fire was an equalizer. It stripped away the ideology, the politics, the revolutionary fervor, reducing men to carbon and bone. "Look at them," the constable whispered, pointing a trembling finger. "They're trying to jump." "They won't make it," Bentley said. His voice sounded flat, distant, as if spoken by someone else standing 10 yards away. "Let them burn." The words hung in the smoky air, ugly and final. The constable looked at him, eyes wide, seeing something in Bentley's face that terrified him more than the flames. It was not anger, it was acceptance. A grim, hollow resignation that said the law had ended where the fire began. The roof timbers gave way with a thunderous crash. A shower of sparks erupted upward, a fountain of gold against the grey sky, swirling with the falling snow. The heat spiked, forcing the entire line to retreat another step. Bentley's coat hem caught a stray ember. He brushed it away without looking down, watching the red spot die on the wet pavement. He thought of Churchill, standing back by the armored car, pristine in his fur-lined coat, cigar smoke curling from his lips. The Home Secretary had ordered this, not with a match but with a word: hold the line, let them cook. The distance between them was measured in yards, but the gap was infinite. Churchill stood in the world of strategy, of headlines and political capital, untouched by the soot, unburned by the heat. Bentley stood in the ash. His collar was stained black, his hands grimy, his soul scrubbed raw by the sight of men turning to cinder. The building settled, the front facade bowing outward like a chest, heaving a final breath. Bricks glowed red through the mortar, the heat so intense the air shimmered, distorting the view of the street beyond. "Sir," the constable said again, his voice cracking, "shouldn't we? Isn't there something?" "There is nothing," Bentley said. He pulled his Webley from his holster, the metal heavy and cold in his grip. A reflex, a comfort, as if a revolver could stop a fire, as if a bullet could kill what was already dead. "Watch the walls. When it goes, it falls out. Keep your heads down." He checked the cylinder. It spun freely, oiled and ready, a stark contrast to the jammed mess it had been an hour ago in the cold. The heat had thawed it. The very fire that was killing the enemy had freed his weapon. Irony tasted like copper in his mouth. Inside, the silence held, unbroken by screams or pleas, leaving only the roar of the consumption. The roll call remained unanswered as the names of the dead added to the list living in Bentley's head, a permanent chorus of ghosts that would never stop singing. A heavy beam crashed through the front window, landing in the street with a spray of molten tar. It rolled towards Bentley's feet, stopping inches from his toes. The wood was still burning, a bright orange eye staring up at him. He kicked it aside. "Steady," he said to the line, to the men, to himself. "It's not over yet." But the shadows in the window had stopped moving. The thrashing had ceased. The fire raged on, hungry and bright, eating the past, eating the future, leaving only the present moment, hot and terrible and absolute. Bentley tightened his grip on the Webley, his knuckles white against the black steel. He waited for the next sound, the next movement, the next sign that the nightmare was done. Nothing came but the fire, and the cold wind, returning to bite at his neck, fighting the heat for dominance over the street. The constable lurched forward, boots skidding on the slick, black slush that coated the pavement. He was young, barely 20, with a face still soft enough to believe that rules applied to fire. His helmet sat crooked, rainwater dripping from the brim onto a collar already stiff with soot. He pointed a gloved hand towards the rear of the tenement, where the brickwork glowed a dull, angry cherry through the billowing smoke. "There's a door, Sarge. I saw it. Someone's trying to get out the back." Bentley moved before the thought fully formed. He grabbed the boy's tunic, fingers digging into the wet wool, and yanked him back. The fabric stretched, then held. The constable stumbled, arms windmilling, eyes wide with a confusion that bordered on panic. "Stay," Bentley said. "But they'll burn, sir. They're trapped." The boy twisted in his grip, desperate, kicking at the ground, as if he could run through the sergeant's hold. "We can't just watch them cook. It's murder." "It's orders." Bentley's voice was flat, a stone dropped into a deep well. He did not shout. He did not need to. The roar of the fire did the shouting for him, a constant, tearing sound like 1,000 sheets of canvas being ripped apart at once. Churchill said, "Hold the line. No one goes in. No one comes out." "That's politics." The constable spat the word, fresh tears cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks. "That's not police work. We're supposed to save lives. That's the job. That's what we swore." Bentley tightened his grip until his own knuckles ached. He could feel the tremor running through the boy's shoulder, a vibration of pure, unadulterated horror. It was contagious. It wanted to spread, to crawl up Bentley's arm and settle in his own chest, to make him drop his weapon and run towards the heat, to drag bodies from the inferno until his own skin blistered and peeled. He remembered Tucker, not the body but the sound, that wet, gurgling intake of breath in the dark hallway at Houndstitch. The light had gone out of his eyes not with a bang but with a slow, leaking fade. He remembered Choate, headless, a statue of red mist, and Woodhams clawing at his own throat. They had not been saved. No one had come for them, for the rules had not helped and the jurisdiction had not mattered. The only thing that had mattered was the lead and the cold and the silence that followed. If he let this boy go, he would die. Simple as that. The heat out there was not just fire, it was a physical weight, a hammer that would crush a man's lungs before the flames even touched him. The anarchists in there, they had chosen this. They had chosen the bullet or the blaze. They had rejected the cage, the trial, the long drop at Pentonville. To pull them out now would be to deny them their final act, their final defiance. And why should they be granted mercy when Tucker had been granted none? Why should the law stretch its hand to save the men who had emptied its revolvers into the dark? The ledger demanded balance, 3 for 3, maybe 4. The fire was the accountant and it was ruthless. "They're people, Sarge," the constable whispered, his fight draining away, replaced by a hollow dread. He stopped struggling, hanging limp in Bentley's grasp. Real people, screaming. Bentley looked past him, through the swirling grey smoke. He saw nothing but the glow, no figures thrashing, no hands beating against the brick, just the orange eye of the destruction blinking slowly as the floorboards gave way. "I hear nothing," Bentley lied. He heard everything. He heard the scratch of a match being struck in a room 3 years ago. He heard the click of a safety catch. He heard the silence of a roll call where 3 names went unanswered. He heard the boy's heart hammering against his own ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of wool and bone. The constable turned his head, looking at Bentley with a new kind of fear. It wasn't fear of the fire anymore. It was fear of the man holding him. He saw the stain on Bentley's collar, the black grease under his fingernails, the deadness in his eyes that matched the deadness in the burning windows. He saw that the line between the hunter and the hunted had blurred, erased by the soot and the cold and the sheer, grinding weight of the winter. "You're letting them die," the boy said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, quiet and terrible. Bentley released him. He shoved the constable back, not roughly, but with a finality that broke the contact. "Hold the line, constable, that is your order." He stepped away, turning his back on the boy, facing the fire alone. The heat hit him like a physical blow, drying the sweat on his forehead instantly. His coat felt heavy, sodden with the meltwater, smelling of wet dog and old smoke. He could taste the ash, gritty on his tongue, coating his teeth. It tasted like copper. It tasted like the blood that had pooled on the floor of the gambling den in December. Detailed checklist. 1. Shadow moved in rear window. 2. Figure distinct now. 3. Silhouetted against inner blaze. 4. Stumbled. 5. The figure did not jump. It did not wave. It simply turned, turning its back on the rescue that would not come, and walked back into the heart of the flame. Gone, swallowed. The constable made a sound, a small broken noise in his throat. He did not move to help. He stood where he was told, shaking, watching the light consume the dark. Bentley felt a surge of something cold and sharp in his gut. Relief, no, not relief, something older, something darker, a grim satisfaction that the math was working out. The equation was solving itself. The fire was doing what the law could not, what the law dared not do. It was purging, it was cleansing, it was balancing the books. He reached for his Webley, habit, comfort. The weight of it in his hand was the only real thing left. The metal was ice cold, leaching the warmth from his palm. He needed to feel it. He needed to know it was there ready, just in case the silence broke, just in case a ghost tried to run. He thumbed the latch. The cylinder swung out. Empty chambers glinted in the firelight. He spun it. It moved stiffly, the frost inside the mechanism resisting the motion. He snapped it shut. "Steady," he said to the line, to the boy, to himself. "It's nearly done." The building groaned again, a deep, tectonic shift that vibrated through the soles of their boots. The front wall bowed, bricks loosening, mortar turning to dust. It was ready to fall, ready to bury the secret, the ideology, the men, the silence. Bentley waited, he listened, he counted. 1, 2, 3. The names stayed in his head. They always would. The fire roared, loud and terrible, but beneath it, underneath the crash and the hiss and the snap of timber, the silence remained, unbroken, absolute. And then a movement, not in the window, in the alley, to the left. A figure, low to the ground, scrambling over the debris, trying to bolt before the final collapse. Bentley's arms snapped up. Instinct took over. Target, threat, job. He squeezed the trigger. Click. The hammer fell on a frozen cylinder. Silence, not the absence of noise, but the erasure of voice. The fire roared. It was a living thing, a beast with a throat of brick and a lung of timber, inhaling the oxygen of the street and exhaling a column of black smoke that punched the low clouds. The sound was absolute, a physical weight pressing against the eardrums, drowning out the shout of the officer, the clatter of the rifle bolt, the distant wail of the fire engines held back by political decree. Yet beneath that cacophony, a void opened up, a hollow space where human sound should have been. Men were dying in there, Svars, Sokolov, perhaps others, faces Bentley had never seen but whose names would soon be carved into stone or scrubbed from the ledger entirely. They were burning, flesh blistered, lungs filled with superheated ash, eyes boiled in their sockets. By every law of nature, by every story told in the mess hall or whispered in the shadows of the gin palaces, they should have been screaming. They should have been shrieking for mercy, cursing God, begging for water. The air should have been thick with their agony. Nothing. Bentley strained his ears, tilting his head as if catching a faint whistle on the wind. He listened for the crack of a window breaking under the pressure of a body thrown against it. He waited for the thud of a fist on glass. He needed the sound. He needed the confirmation that they were still men, still capable of pain, still bound by the same fragile biology that had failed Tucker, Choate, and Woodhams in the cold yard at Houndsditch. The flames licked higher, wrapping around the remaining window frames like golden serpents. The wood blackened, curled, and vanished. Still, no cry emerged. "It's wrong," the constable beside him muttered, his hand gripping the strap of his belt until the leather creaked. "They must be dead already, quick." "No," Bentley said. The word felt dry, scraping his throat. "Not yet." He knew the signs of quick death, a bullet through the brain, a snapped neck, the sudden stop of a heart. This was not that. This was slow. This was the deliberate unraveling of life, strand by painful strand, and they were taking it in silence. The memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. The yard at Houndsditch, the smell of wet cobblestones and blood. Tucker had gone down first, a hole in his chest leaking life onto the frost. He hadn't screamed, just a wet gurgle, a sound like water draining from a basin, and then the stillness. Choate had followed, his head simply ceasing to exist as a coherent object, taking his voice with it before it could form a syllable. Woodhams had tried. Bentley remembered the way his mouth had moved, shaping a vowel, a name, a prayer, but the blood had filled his lungs first, choking the sound before it could escape. 3 men, 3 silences, a roll call that never resolved. Now the anarchists completed the set. They refused to give the street the satisfaction of their pain. They refused to let the crowd, the press, the politicians hear them break. It was a final act of defiance, more potent than any bullet fired from the upper windows. They were denying the state its victory song. They were dying on their own terms, in their own quiet, leaving the living to fill the air with their own speculation and fear. "Maybe they can't," the constable suggested, his voice rising over the crackle of the burning roof. "The smoke, it takes the voice first." "Maybe," Bentley agreed, but he didn't believe it. He watched the facade of the building. The bricks were glowing now, a dull, angry red seeping through the mortar lines. The heat was so intense it distorted the air, making the windows waver like pools of oil. Inside that furnace, men were turning to carbon. Their clothes, their papers, their revolutionary pamphlets, their guns, all of it was being reduced to ash. And yet they held their tongues. Bentley knew it was a trick of the mind, for the roar of the fire was simply too loud. If they were screaming, the sound was swallowed by that greater noise, lost in the vacuum the flames created. That was the physics of it, the acoustics of destruction. Yet it felt like something else. It felt like a choice. A section of the cornice broke away, crashing onto the pavement with a spray of sparks. The noise was deafening, a gunshot amplified 100 times. Bentley flinched, his hand tightening on the grip of his Webley. The constable jumped back, stumbling into the slush. "Steady," Bentley snapped, though his own heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He looked at the windows again. The glass had melted, leaving dark, jagged mouths gaping at the street. Through the haze of smoke, he thought he saw a shape move, a shadow detaching itself from the wall. It stumbled forward, arms outstretched, reaching for the fresh air, the cold, the salvation of the snow. Bentley held his breath. He waited for the scream that must come now, as the air hit the burned lungs, as the realization of the fall took hold. The figure reached the sill. The flames caught the sleeves of its coat, flaring bright yellow. The man paused, silhouetted against the inferno. He looked out, not down, his face obscured by the soot and the glare. He did not cry out. He did not wave. He simply stood there, a statue of blackened flesh, acknowledging the crowd, the police, the army, the Home Secretary watching from his car. Then he stepped back. He turned away from the window, away from the chance of escape, and walked back into the heart of the fire. He disappeared into the orange glow, swallowed whole. No sound followed, no thud, no final plea. The constable made a noise in his throat, a gag of horror. He went back. Why did he go back? To finish it, Bentley said. His voice was low, stripped of emotion, on their own terms. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. It pressed against Bentley's chest, heavier than the heat, colder than the wind that whipped around his ankles. It was the same silence that had lived in his head since December, the silence of 3 empty chairs at the roll call, Tucker, Choate, Woodhams, and now these men joining the chorus of the unanswered. The fire roared on, indifferent. It consumed the room where the man had stood, eating the floorboards, the walls, the history of the place. It did not care about defiance. It did not care about silence. It only cared for fuel. Bentley shifted his stance, the slush soaking through the sole of his boot. The cold was creeping back in, fighting the heat, biting at his exposed skin. He could feel the frost settling on his eyelashes, blurring his vision. He blinked it away, keeping his eyes fixed on the burning windows. "Sir," the constable's voice was small, trembling. "What do we do now?" Bentley didn't answer immediately. He listened to the fire, to the crash of falling timber, to the hiss of melting snow. He listened for the voices that would never come. The roll call was complete. The ledger was balanced. 3 for 3, maybe 4. The math worked out, clean and precise, in the arithmetic of the dead. "We wait," Bentley said finally. He kept his hand on the Webley, the metal cold against his palm. "We wait for it to fall." The building groaned, a deep, structural complaint that vibrated through the soles of his feet. The front wall bowed outward, the bricks loosening in their mortar. It was ready to go, ready to collapse into the street, burying the silence under a mountain of rubble. Bentley took a step back, pulling the constable with him. The heat spiked again, a final surge of energy before the end. The air shimmered, distorting the world into a nightmare painting of orange and gray. And in the center of it all, the silence held, absolute and unbroken, stretching into the eternal. It was the loudest thing Bentley had ever heard. He tightened his grip on the revolver, his knuckles white. He waited for the crash, for the dust, for the end of the chapter. But the silence remained, clinging to him, settling into his bones, promising to stay long after the fire was out and the bodies were cold. A sudden movement in the rear alley caught his eye. A figure, distinct from the others, scrambling over the debris, trying to bolt before the final collapse. Bentley's arms snapped up as instinct took over, overriding the awe, the horror, the philosophy of silence. There was a target, a threat, and a job to finish. He squeezed the trigger. Click! The hammer fell on a frozen cylinder. The Webley refused to turn. The cold, deep in the mechanism, had seized its solid, defying the heat of the fire, defying his need. Bentley stared at the gun, disbelief flooding his veins. The silence of the burning men was broken only by the click of his own failure. Steam hissed. White plumes rose from the blackened ribs of number 100, curling into the gray dawn like the last breaths of men who had no names left to speak. The tenement stood as a skeleton, its brickwork scorched to a deep, bruised purple, the mortar crumbling under the assault of frost and fire. Snow had fallen during the night, a thin, deceptive dusting that now melted instantly wherever it touched the still-glowing embers beneath the rubble, creating a slurry of ice, ash, and something darker, something that smelled of burnt wool and cooked meat. Bentley stepped over the cordon rope, the wet hemp slick against his gloved hand. He did not ask permission. The soldiers guarding the perimeter, their uniforms stiff with cold, watched him pass with wide, uncertain eyes, unsure if this grime-covered spectre was friend or foe, policeman or survivor. He ignored them. His boots crunched on the ground, a sound that was too loud in the heavy air, crushing fragments of brick, and something brittle that might have been bone, might have been nothing at all. The smell hit him first, not the sharp, acrid sting of cordite that had filled the street during the barrage, nor the coal smoke haze that usually choked the East End. This was deeper, organic. It clung to the back of his throat, a greasy film that no amount of swallowing could dislodge. It was the scent of a slaughterhouse left open in January, of hair and fabric and flesh fused together by heat intense enough to warp steel. He gagged once, a dry heave that twisted his gut, but he kept walking. 3 days, or was it 4? Time had lost its shape somewhere between the first shot fired at Houndsditch and the final collapse of the roof here on Sydney Street. The calendar said January 4th, 1911, but Bentley's body felt older, worn down to the nub like a pencil used too hard against rough paper. His fingers twitched at his side, reaching instinctively for the Webley in his holster before stopping. The revolver was useless now, the cylinder seized tight by the frost, the mechanism jammed solid until human warmth could coax it back to life, just like everything else. The door latches that had refused to turn, the pocket watches that had stopped ticking, the men who had stopped breathing. He navigated the debris field with a strange, shuffling gait, avoiding the larger piles of masonry where the fire had burned hottest. Steam rose from these spots in thick, choking columns, obscuring his vision, making the world swim and distort. Through the haze, the silhouette of the building loomed, a jagged tooth against the pale sky. Windows were gone, blown out by the pressure of the flames or shattered by the Maxim gun's relentless chatter, leaving empty sockets that seemed to stare directly at him. Clear, a voice called out. A soldier, face blackened with soot, emerged from the shadows of the ground floor, dragging a length of charred timber. He dropped it with a thud that sent up a cloud of grey dust. Nothing left in there, Sarge, just ash. Bentley nodded, though the man likely didn't see it through the steam. Keep digging, he said, his voice raspy, stripped bare by smoke and disuse. Leave nothing turned over. The soldier hesitated, leaning on his rifle. Bit grim, isn't it? Burning them like this doesn't seem right. It's done, Bentley said. He didn't look at the man. He couldn't. If he looked, he might see the judgment in those young eyes, the same judgment he carried in his own chest. The order was given. The fire took them. That is the end of it. The Home Secretary said, I know what he said. Bentley cut him off, sharp and sudden. The anger flared hot in his belly, surprising him with its intensity. He tamped it down, forcing his shoulders to relax, his hands to unclench. Just do your job, lad. Find what remains. Give them a burial, however much there is to bury. The soldier muttered an apology, or perhaps a curse, and turned back to the ruins, kicking at a pile of debris with the toe of his boot. Bentley watched him for a moment, the rhythmic scrape of metal on brick providing a steady, mundane counterpoint to the chaos of the scene. It was a sound of work, of cleanup, of the world trying to return to normal after a rupture that had torn through the very fabric of the city, but nothing would be normal. Not for the neighbors who had fled their flats in the night, huddled in nightshirts against the snow. Not for the crowd gathering behind the lines, hungry for a glimpse of the carnage, and certainly not for Bentley. He moved deeper into the ruin, stepping carefully where the floorboards had collapsed into the cellar below. The heat radiating from the ground was intense, seeping through the soles of his boots, a cruel reminder of the violence that had occurred here. He stopped beside a section of wall that had remained standing, a solitary island in a sea of destruction. On it, someone had scrawled a message in chalk before the fire took hold, the white letters now smudged and running with moisture. Workers of the world. The rest was gone, eaten by the flames, leaving the sentiment incomplete, a promise broken before it could be fulfilled. Bentley reached out and touched the wall. The plaster was warm, vibrating slightly with the residual heat of the bricks behind it. He traced the edge of the remaining letters with a gloved finger, feeling the rough texture of the surface, the grit of the soot that coated everything. It was a futile gesture. The words meant nothing now. The ideology that had driven men to barricade themselves in this room, to choose death over surrender, had been reduced to carbon and steam. The revolution had ended not with a manifesto, but with a whimper of dying embers. A gust of wind swept through the gutted room, carrying with it a swirl of ash that danced in the dim light before settling again on the floor. It coated his trousers, settled in the creases of his coat, found its way into the gaps between his scarf and his neck. He shivered, not from the cold, but from a sudden, overwhelming sense of contamination. He was covered in it. The soot of the East End, the residue of the fire, the dust of the dead. It was in his lungs, in his hair, under his fingernails. He rubbed at his face with his sleeve, but the grime only smeared, turning his skin a muddy grey. He looked down at his boots. They were caked in a mixture of snow and black sludge, the leather stiff and cracking. He kicked at the ground, trying to dislodge the buildup, but it held fast, fused to the material by heat and time, just like the collar around his neck. He could feel it there, stiff and abrasive, rubbing against his skin with every turn of his head. He knew without looking that it was black beyond cleaning, a permanent stain that marked him as one of them. Not a servant of the law, not a restorer of order, but just another man covered in the filth of a dirty business. "Anything," he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the hollow space. "Nothing identifiable, Sarge," came the reply from the shadows, "just fragments, bone mostly, and metal." Bentley closed his eyes. The image formed instantly, unbidden and horrific. Two men, or what was left of them, huddled together in the corner as the roof came down, the fire consuming them until there was nothing left but calcified remains and twisted watch chains. Svars and Sokolov, or perhaps others, it didn't matter. They were all the same now, dust to dust, ash to ash. He turned away from the wall, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were moving through water. The steam was thinning now, the fire finally exhausting its fuel, leaving behind a landscape of grey monotony. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, a pale, watery disk that offered light but no warmth. It illuminated the devastation with a cruel clarity, highlighting every scorched beam, every pile of rubble, every footprint in the slush. He began to walk back towards the street, his path taking him past the spot where the Maxim gun had been positioned. The tripod marks were still visible in the snow-deep indentations where the weight of the weapon had pressed down. Beside them lay a scattering of brass casings, glinting dully in the weak light. He stopped and looked at them. Hundreds of rounds fired, thousands, enough to tear a building apart, to shred human flesh into unrecognizable pulp. And for what? To ensure no one escaped, to make a point. He kicked a casing. It skittered across the frozen ground, spinning before coming to rest against a chunk of fallen brick. The sound was sharp, metallic, cutting through the silence. It sounded like a gunshot or a door closing. Sarge, the soldier, was back, standing at the edge of the ruin, holding something in his hand. A piece of metal, twisted and blackened. "Found this, near the cellar steps." Bentley walked over and took it. It was a buckle, a belt buckle, brass partially melted. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the weight of it, the rough edges where the heat had distorted the shape. There was an inscription on the back, faint but legible, Riga. He stared at it for a long moment, the word echoing in his mind. Riga, a city thousands of miles away, a place of snow and ice and revolution, just like this one. A place where men dreamed of overthrowing empires and ended up burning in tenements in the East End of London. He closed his fist around the buckle, the metal biting into his palm, cold and hard. "Keep it," he said, handing it back. "Evidence." The soldier nodded, pocketing the item with a solemnity that seemed out of place amidst the ruin. "Right you are, Sarge." Bentley pushed past him, stepping out onto the pavement where the air was cleaner, colder. The crowd had grown larger, pressing against the police lines, their faces eager, hungry for spectacle. They pointed at the building, at the soldiers, at him. Whispers rippled through the mass, a sea of sound that rose and fell with the wind. He ignored them, focusing instead on the street ahead, the long stretch of road that led away from here, away from the fire and the death. He needed to move, needed to put distance between himself and this place before the numbness wore off and the reality of what had happened crashed down upon him. He adjusted his collar, the stiff fabric scratching against his chin, and began to walk. His boots crunched on the snow, a steady, rhythmic sound that matched the beating of his own heart. One step, then another, leaving the skeleton of the house behind, leaving the ghosts to their silence. But the silence was not empty, it never was. As he walked, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound that was not the wind at all, a voice, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Bentley! He froze, the word hung in the air, suspended in the frost. Roll call, Sarge. Another voice joined the first, then a third, familiar voices, voices he had heard every morning for years, voices that had gone unanswered on a cold street in December. Tucker, Choate, Woodhams, they were not angry, they were not accusing, they were simply waiting, asking the question that had no answer, asking for their names to be spoken. Bentley tilted his head back, letting the snow fall on his face, melting into the grime on his cheeks. He opened his mouth to speak, to say their names, to complete the count. But the words froze in his throat, locked tight by the cold and the guilt and the terrible, crushing knowledge that some roll calls are never finished. He stood there in the middle of the street, the crowd cheering behind him, the ruins smoking before him, and listened to the silence. It was the only answer they would ever get. He took a step forward, then another, walking alone into the grey morning, the voices echoing in his head, unresolved and eternal, a permanent internal roll call that would never, ever resolve. The click hung in the air, a dry, brittle sound that died before it could reach the cheering crowds gathering behind the cordon. Bentley stared at the revolver. The cylinder sat locked, a frozen disc of steel refusing to yield to the thumb that had worked it 1,000 times in the drill yard. He rubbed his thumb over the catch again, harder this time, grinding the skin raw against the cold metal, but the mechanism remained stubborn, seized by the same deep frost that had turned the gutters to iron. Useless, he muttered. The word vanished into the hiss of steam rising from the rubble. He shoved the Webley back into its holster, the leather stiff and cracking under the movement, and forced his gaze away from the burning shell of number 100. The fire had done its work. The orange roar had diminished to a sullen, glowing pulse within the blackened brickwork, a dying heart beating slower with every passing minute. Smoke, thick and oily, curled upwards to meet the grey sky, mixing with the falling snowflakes which died instantly upon contact, vanishing without a trace. Bentley stepped off the curb, his boots sinking into the slush that coated the street. It was a foul soup of melted snow, coal dust, and something darker, something that smelled of wet wool and burnt meat. He kept his head down, navigating the debris field with the careful, shuffling gait of a man walking on glass. Around him, the scene was one of chaotic stillness. Soldiers from the Scots Guards stood picket, their rifles grounded, bayonets fixed, watching the ruins with the detached curiosity of tourists at a ruin. Firemen hacked at the remaining timbers, sending up fresh plumes of acrid smoke that made the eyes water and the throat tighten. He needed to move. Standing here, watching the ashes settle, felt like an admission of defeat. A gust of wind swept down Sydney Street, funneling between the buildings and scattering a drift of grey ash across the pavement. It danced in the air, light and insubstantial, before settling again in the gutter near his feet. Something white caught his eye amidst the darkness. Not snow. Snow was dirty here, stained brown by the city's grime. This was clean, sharp-edged. Bentley crouched. His knees popped, a sharp crack that sounded too loud in the relative quiet of his immediate vicinity. He reached out, his gloved fingers brushing aside a layer of soot to reveal the object. A playing card. The king of clubs. It lay face up, miraculously untouched by the flames that had consumed everything else within a 10-foot radius. The edges were slightly singed, curled from the heat, but the face was pristine, the ink bold and black against the white background. The king stared up at him, crowned and sceptered, a monarch of a realm that no longer existed. Bentley picked it up. The cardstock was damp, cold against his fingertips. He turned it over in his hand, examining the back. A simple geometric pattern, red and blue, now faded to pink and grey by the smoke. It was a trivial thing, a piece of pasteboard used for gambling, for passing time in a warm room, for laughter. "What are you doing then, Sarge?" The voice came from above. Bentley looked up to see a young constable, face smudged with dirt, leaning on a shovel. The boy's eyes were wide, fixed on the card in Bentley's hand as if it were a live grenade. "Looking," Bentley said. "Looking for what? There's nothing left but bones." The constable spat into the slush, a glob of phlegm that landed inches from Bentley's boot. "They're all gone, burnt to cinders. Churchill says we got the lot of them." Bentley said nothing. He ran his thumb over the face of the king. The image seemed to mock him. Here was a symbol of order, of hierarchy, of rule, lying in the gutter of the East End, surrounded by the wreckage of a revolution that had promised to overthrow kings and masters alike. And yet, in the end, the king remained, unburnt, unbroken, while the men who sought to topple him were reduced to ash and memory. "It's just a card," the constable said, shifting his weight, uncomfortable with the silence. "Not worth the trouble, is it? Not after all that." He gestured vaguely at the smoking ruin with the handle of his shovel. "All that shooting, all that fire, for a bunch of anarchists and a pack of cards." "Maybe," Bentley said. He tucked the card into his breast pocket, inside his tunic, close to the warmth of his body. It felt strange there, a flat, rigid rectangle against his ribs, distinct from the soft give of flesh and wool. A souvenir, a testament, he wasn't sure which. "Come on," Bentley said, standing up. His joints protested, stiff from the cold and the crouch. "Get back to work, clear the perimeter." The constable straightened, saluting clumsily before turning back to the rubble. "Right you are, Sarge." Bentley walked away, moving deeper into the shadow of the building. The applause started then. It began as a low murmur, a ripple of sound moving through the crowd gathered behind the police lines before swelling into a roar. They were cheering for the soldiers, cheering for Churchill, who stood atop his motorcar, hat in hand, acknowledging the adulation with a broad, triumphant smile. The Home Secretary looked immaculate. His coat was brushed, his face clean, untouched by the soot that coated everyone else. He looked like a man who had won a game of chess, not a man who had just presided over a cremation. The sound washed over Bentley, hollow and distant. It sounded like rain on a tin roof, meaningless noise that filled the air but touched nothing. He stopped walking, turning slightly to watch the spectacle. Men in uniform were slapping each other on the back, grinning, their breath pluming in the cold air. Women waved handkerchiefs. Children climbed onto shoulders to get a better view of the hero of the hour. They saw a victory, order restored, the threat neutralized, the beast slain. Bentley saw only the math: 3 men dead in Houndsditch, 2 men dead here, a building destroyed, a street scarred, and a silence that would never truly go away. He reached up and touched his collar. It was stiff, crusted with a layer of black grime that had settled there during the long night. He rubbed at it with his thumb, but the stain didn't budge. It was worked into the fabric, deep and permanent. He looked down at his hands. They were black too. His cuffs, his trousers, his boots. He was covered in it. The soot of the East End, the residue of the fire, the dust of the dead. He was no cleaner than the men who had burned inside that house. A group of officers passed him, laughing, their faces flushed with adrenaline and pride. One of them, an inspector from the Met, clapped Bentley on the shoulder. "Good show, Bentley, good show. We'll have them pinned down in no time now, the whole lot of them." Bentley flinched, the touch burning through his coat. He stepped back out of reach. "Yes," he said, "good show." The inspector frowned, sensing the lack of enthusiasm, but shrugged it off, moving on to join the celebration. "Come on, Robert," he called over his shoulder. "Have a drink with us." Churchill's popping open a bottle. "No," Bentley said, "I have to file the report." "Report," the inspector laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Leave that for tomorrow, man. Today we celebrate." "Tomorrow," Bentley repeated. He turned away from them, away from the cheering, away from the smiling face of Winston Churchill. He began to walk, his pace steady, his eyes fixed on the street ahead. The snow was falling harder now, covering the tracks, the blood, the debris, wrapping the world in a blanket of white. It would not last. The sun would come out, the snow would melt, and the mud would return. But for now, it was quiet. He walked past the cordon, past the soldiers, past the ruins of number 100. He walked until the applause faded, until the only sound was the crunch of his own footsteps on the snow. And then, faintly, barely audible over the wind, he heard them. "Bentley!" He stopped. "Roll call, Sarge." The voices were soft, ghostly, carried on the edge of the wind. Tucker, Choate, Woodhams, they were not angry, they were not accusing, they were simply waiting, asking the question that had no answer, asking for their names to be spoken. Bentley closed his eyes. He tilted his head back, letting the snow fall on his face, melting into the grime on his cheeks. He opened his mouth to speak, to say their names, to complete the count. But the words froze in his throat. He stood there in the middle of the empty street, the king of clubs pressing against his heart, and listened to the silence. It was the only answer they would ever get. He took a step forward, then another, walking alone into the grey morning, the roll call echoing in his head, unresolved and eternal. The radiator hissed, a wet, rattling gasp that filled the small office like a dying man's breath. Bentley ignored it. He sat at the desk, the wood worn smooth by 30 years of elbows and inkwells, and dipped his pen into the well. The ink was thick, black and cold. It clung to the nib, reluctant to flow, just as the memory of the fire clung to the back of his throat. Outside, London carried on. A cart rattled over the cobbles, the iron rim striking a spark that vanished instantly in the grey afternoon light. Somewhere, a newsboy shouted headlines about the Home Secretary's bravery, his voice cracking on the high notes, eager to sell the triumph of the state to anyone with a halfpenny. Bentley pressed the nib to the paper. "Incident report, Sydney Street." The scratch was loud, too loud. It tore through the quiet room, a harsh, dry friction that sounded nothing like the roar of the Maxim gun, but somehow carried the same weight. He wrote the date, January 4th, 1911. The numbers formed slowly, each loop of the 4 requiring a deliberate twist of the wrist. His fingers were stiff. The joints ached with a deep, bone-level throb, the cold from the siege having seeped past the wool of his gloves and settled into the marrow. He rubbed his thumb against the side of the pen, feeling the ridges of the metal, grounding himself in the tangible, mundane reality of the station office. Here, the air smelled of stale tobacco, damp wool, and the sharp, chemical tang of copying fluid. No cordite, no burning timber, no the sweet, sickening odor of cooked meat that had drifted from the ruins only hours before. "Still at it, Sarge?" Bentley did not look up. He knew the voice. Constable Miller. Young, unmarked, his collar still crisp despite the long shift. Miller stood by the door, holding a tray with 2 chipped mugs of tea. Steam curled from the rims, twisting into the stale air before dissipating. "The report needs filing, Miller," Bentley said. His voice sounded rough, scraped raw from shouting orders over the crack of rifles and the crash of falling masonry. "Protocol dictates submission by end of shift." "Shift ended an hour ago." Miller stepped inside, his boots squeaking on the linoleum. He set the tray down on the corner of the desk, careful not to disturb the stack of forms. "Drink this. It's got sugar in it, proper strong." Bentley paused. The pen hovered above the line where he was meant to list the officers present. He looked at the mug. The tea was dark, almost opaque, a thin skin forming on the surface. He could smell the tannins, earthy and bitter. It was a kindness, a simple human gesture in a room dedicated to the cold mechanics of the law. "Thank you," he said. He did not reach for it, not yet. "You should go home," Miller said, leaning against the doorframe. He crossed his arms, trying to look casual, but his eyes kept darting to Bentley's hands. "The chief inspector said we're all to stand down, no more patrols tonight. Let the Met sort out the cordon." "The cordon is secure." "It's a ruin, Sarge, just bricks and ash." Miller shifted his weight, the leather of his belt creaking. "Nothing left in there but charcoal. Churchill's already gone. Motorcar pulled away 10 minutes ago, heading back to Whitehall for a press statement." Bentley's jaw tightened, a muscle feathered beneath the grime on his cheek. He could picture it perfectly. Churchill, immaculate in his fur-lined coat, stepping into the warmth of the Daimler, leaving the soot and the silence behind. The Home Secretary would speak of order restored, of the triumph of British justice over foreign anarchy. He would not mention the 2 men burned alive in the attic. He would not mention the way the flames had licked the sky, turning the snow black, or the terrible final silence that had followed the collapse of the roof. "Let him speak," Bentley said. He dipped the pen again. The ink flowed sluggishly, leaving a blot where he had paused too long. "We have our own duties." "Duties?" Miller laughed, a short, nervous sound. "What duties? The war's over, Sarge, we won." Bentley looked up then. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites yellowed with fatigue. He stared at Miller, really stared, seeing the clean uniform, the unblemished face, the lack of understanding that sat behind the young constable's gaze like a wall. Miller saw a victory parade. Bentley saw a ledger that did not balance. 3 names missing from the Houndstitch roll, 2 more added today. And for what? A pile of rubble and a headline. "Is that what you think this was?" Bentley asked. His voice was low, barely audible over the hiss of the radiator. "A game, something to be won." Miller's smile faltered. He uncrossed his arms, letting them fall to his sides. "No, Sarge, I just mean, it's done. They're dead. We're alive. That's the job, isn't it?" "The job," Bentley repeated. He turned his attention back to the paper. The ink blot had spread, a dark, irregular stain that obscured the line beneath it. He stared at it, watching the liquid soak into the fibers of the page, swallowing the words before he could even write them. It looked like a wound, a fresh, weeping injury on the pristine white of the official record. "Yes, that is the job." He tried to write the next line. "Officers deployed," but the pen caught on the damp spot, skipping across the paper, leaving a jagged trail of black. He pressed harder, forcing the nib down, but the paper resisted, buckling under the pressure. The ink pooled, spreading further, consuming the space where he intended to write the names of the men who had stood beside him in the freezing alleyway. Men who were now gone, men whose voices were silent forever. "Leave the tea, Miller," Bentley said. He did not look up. He kept his eyes fixed on the spreading stain, watching it grow, wondering if he could scrape it away with the tip of his knife, or if it would remain there, a permanent mark on the document, a testament to the messiness of the thing they had done. "Sarge." "Go on." Bentley's tone was flat, devoid of anger, devoid of anything really, just empty, dismissed. Miller hesitated. He wanted to say something else, some platitude about getting some rest, about how it wasn't Bentley's fault, but the words died in his throat. He saw the set of Bentley's shoulders, the rigid line of his spine, the way his hand gripped the pen like a weapon. There was no comfort to be offered here, not in this room, not with that smell of smoke still clinging to the sergeant's coat, a scent that no amount of washing would ever fully remove. "Right," Miller said softly. "Good night, Sarge." The door clicked shut, the latch engaged with a solid, final snap. Bentley was alone again. The radiator hissed, the tea cooled, and the ink stain continued to spread, dark and irreversible, blurring the line between the living and the dead, between the report and the reality, until the names he needed to write were lost completely, swallowed by the black, silent void of the paper. He set the pen down. The wood of the desk felt cold beneath his palms. He listened to the silence, waiting for a sound that would not come, knowing that the roll call in his head had already begun, and that this time there would be no answers. The blot widened, a slow black bloom. It ate the white space where Sergeant Tucker should have sat, the ink pushing through the fibers like a bruise rising on skin, swelling until the letters beneath were gone, swallowed by a darkness that no amount of scraping with a fingernail could lift. Bentley watched it. He did not blink. The radiator clanked, a hollow iron cough that echoed in the small room, but the sound seemed to come from far away, muffled by the thick wool of his own exhaustion. He reached for the blotting paper, a square of grey felt sitting near the inkwell, but his hand stopped halfway. Why bother? The stain was already there, the damage done. To press the blotter down now would only smudge the edges, make the wound look messier, as if the blood had been wiped away in a panic rather than accepted as the cost of doing business. He let his hand drop back to the desk. The wood felt greasy under his palm, slick with the oil of 1,000 previous reports, a surface worn smooth by the friction of other men writing down other deaths. Outside, a cart rumbled over the cobbles, the iron rim of the wheels striking a stone with a sharp crack that made his shoulder twitch. A reflex, old habits dying hard. He waited for the shout, the gunshot, the scramble of boots, but nothing came. Just the rumble fading into the distance, replaced by the drip of a tap in the washroom down the hall. Plip, plip. a metronome for the dead. Bentley picked up the pen again. The nib was bent slightly from where he had pressed too hard earlier, a tiny hook of steel that caught on the rough grain of the paper. He tried to write Constable Choate. The pen skipped. It dragged a dry line across the page, leaving a furrow in the pulp but no mark, no evidence that the name had ever been intended. He dipped the nib again, swirling it in the well to gather more fluid, watching the black liquid cling to the metal, heavy and viscous. He brought it back to the paper. Choate. The C formed, a shaky curve, but as he moved to the H, the nib caught on the damp edge of the earlier blot. The ink bled out instantly, flooding the letter, turning it into a shapeless lump of carbon. "Damn it," he whispered. The word hung in the air, thin and brittle. He stared at the ruin of the line. It was no longer a list of names. It was a map of failures, a geography of loss where the borders had dissolved into a single, dark sea. He could see Tucker's face in the ink, the way the man's moustache had twitched when he was annoyed, the specific grey of his eyes on that morning in Houndsditch when the frost had glued his eyelids together. He could hear Choate's voice, cracking on the high notes when he sang in the choir at St. Paul's, a sound so pure it seemed impossible that it had been silenced by a Mauser bullet. And Woodhams, young Woodhams, who had written to his mother every Sunday without fail, promising her he would be home for Christmas, a promise that had turned to ash in a tenement on Sydney Street. The state survived. The crown remained. The Union Jack still flew over the station house, snapping in the wind, a symbol of order and continuity. But the men who held the line, who stood in the freezing alleys and took the bullets meant for others, they were gone. Erased, not just from the earth, but from the record. The official document in front of him, the one that would be filed in the archives at New Scotland Yard, the one that would be cited in parliamentary questions and newspaper editorials, it would not contain them. Not really. It would contain their ranks, their numbers, perhaps the date of their demise, but it would not contain the warmth of their breath, the weight of their boots on the pavement, the specific way they laughed at a bad joke. Those things were lost, swallowed by the cold. Bentley pushed the paper away. It slid across the desk with a dry rasp, stopping just before the edge. He leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under his weight, and looked up at the ceiling. The plaster was stained with water damage, a yellow-brown patch that looked like a continent on a map, an uncharted territory of neglect. He wondered if anyone ever looked up and saw it. Or if they just stared at their desks, at their forms, at the endless river of paperwork that flowed through the station, washing over everything, burying the truth under layers of bureaucracy. A fly buzzed against the windowpane. It was January, there should be no flies, but there it was, beating its wings against the glass, trying to find a way out, driven mad by the artificial warmth of the room. BZZT, BZZT, a frantic, meaningless sound. Bentley watched it for a moment, feeling a strange kinship with the insect, trapped, confused, beating itself against a barrier it could not understand. He reached for the tea Miller had left. The mug was lukewarm now, the skin on the surface broken, the liquid beneath grey and uninviting. He took a sip anyway. It tasted of dust and tannins, bitter and flat. He swallowed it, feeling the warmth spread through his chest, a temporary comfort that did nothing to thaw the ice in his veins. He needed to finish the report. The chief inspector would want it on his desk by morning. There were protocols to follow, boxes to tick, but the words would not come. Every time he tried to form a sentence, his mind drifted back to the fire, to the heat, to the sound of the timbers groaning as the roof collapsed, a sound like the earth itself breaking open. He had stood there, watching the flames devour the building, and he had felt nothing. No pity, no rage. Just a cold, hard satisfaction that it was over, that the killing had stopped. And now, sitting in the quiet of the office, that satisfaction felt like a poison. It sat in his gut, heavy and sour, twisting his insides. He picked up the pen one last time. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the cold metal against his skin. He looked at the blank space below the ruined names. There was room for one more line. Sergeant R. Bentley. He could write it. He could add his own name to the list, not as a survivor but as something else, something complicit. He hovered the nib over the paper. The ink gathered at the tip, a single, perfect droplet waiting to fall. But he did not write. He could not. The hand that had held the revolver, that had given the orders, that had stood firm while the building burned, it refused to move. It refused to commit the final lie to paper. To say that he was the same man who had walked into the station 3 days ago, he was not. That man was gone, burned up in the fire along with Svars and Sokolov. What remained was something else, something hollow, a shell. The droplet fell. It hit the paper with a tiny, almost inaudible plip. Another blot, another stain. It joined the others, a cluster of dark spots that looked like a constellation of dead stars. Bentley watched them merge, the edges blurring together until they were indistinguishable from one another, just black on white, noise in the silence. He set the pen down. The click of the nib against the inkwell sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He stood up. His knees cracked, the joints stiff from the cold and the long hours of sitting. He walked to the window and looked out. The fog had thickened, pressing against the glass, a grey wall that hid the world outside. He could see nothing, no street, no buildings, no people, just the fog, endless, swallowing fog. He turned away from the window. The report lay on the desk, unfinished, a testament to nothing. He would leave it, let the chief inspector deal with it, let him fill in the blanks, make up the lies, smooth over the rough edges. Bentley was done. He had counted the cost. He had tallied the ledger, and the sum was 0. He walked to the door. His hand rested on the latch, the metal cold under his fingers. He paused. For a second he thought he heard a voice, faint, distant, calling his name. Bentley, he held his breath, listened, but there was nothing, just the hiss of the radiator, the drip of the tap, the buzz of the fly against the glass. He opened the door and stepped out into the corridor. The darkness swallowed him whole. The corridor stretched, a throat of brick and shadow that seemed to constrict the air until breathing felt like swallowing gravel. Bentley's boots clicked on the stone flags, a sharp, lonely rhythm that bounced off the whitewashed walls and returned to him distorted, slower than it should have been. He kept walking. The squad room waited at the end, a rectangle of gaslight and tobacco smoke, where the night shift stood arranged in 2 ragged lines, caps tucked under arms, faces grey with exhaustion. They did not speak. They watched him approach with the wary stillness of men waiting for a verdict. Miller stood at the front, young, 24 if he was a day, his tunic buttoned wrong at the collar, a slip that would have earned a reprimand any other night. Bentley said nothing about it. He took his place before them, the wood of the podium digging into his hips through the thin wool of his trousers. The ink on his fingers had dried black, cracking when he curled his hand into a fist. He looked at the faces, 12 men, alive. Warm blood pumping behind eyes that blinked, that shifted, that avoided his gaze. "Roll," Bentley said. His voice sounded flat, drained of the authority that used to fill the room. It hung there, suspended in the haze of cigarette smoke. "Miller," Bentley said. "Here, Sarge." Miller's voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "Here." "Davies." "Here." "Wilson." "Here." The names fell from Bentley's lips like stones dropped down a well, each one hitting the bottom with a dull thud that vibrated in his chest. He moved down the list, ticking them off in his head, a mechanical process that required no thought, only memory. The rhythm took over. Name, response, a binary code of existence. Present, present, present. Then the list reached the break, the point where the paper in the office was stained with ink, the point where the world had stopped turning. "Tucker." He said it, he did not skip it. Protocol demanded the name be called until the body was recovered or the status changed by order of the chief. But there was no body. There was only the hole in the ground at Houndstitch and the silence that had followed the shots. Bentley waited. The room held its breath. 12 men stood rigid, eyes fixed on the wall behind Bentley's head, refusing to look at each other. "Here, Bob." The voice was clear. It came from the left side of the room, near the rack where the helmets hung. It was Tucker's voice, rough with tobacco and the cold he'd been fighting all December. Bentley flinched. A visible jerk of the shoulder, a tightening of the jaw that Miller saw. Miller's hand twitched towards his belt, not for a weapon, but as if seeking anchor. "Choate," Bentley said. He pushed the sound out through teeth that felt too large for his mouth. The gaslight flickered, the mantle buzzing like an angry insect. "Rolling, Sarge." Choate, always cheerful, always ready with a joke about the governor's moustache. The voice came from the back, near the window where the condensation ran down the glass in thick, oily tears. Bentley's fingers gripped the edge of the podium. The wood splintered under the pressure, a small snag catching on his skin. he did not let go. Woodams. Nothing. For a second there was nothing, just the hum of the gas and the smell of wet wool drying on radiators. Then, a whisper, so faint it might have been the wind outside pressing against the frame. Present. Woodams, the youngest, the one who had written to his mother every Sunday without fail. Bentley closed his eyes. When he opened them, Miller was staring at him. The young constable's face had drained of color, leaving the skin translucent and waxy. He looked at Bentley not with respect, but with a kind of terrified pity, the way a man looks at a corpse that has just sat up in the box. Dismissed, Bentley said. The word landed heavy. The spell broke. Men exhaled, shoulders dropping, boots scuffing as they turned to the lockers. The sound of movement was loud, clumsy, a desperate attempt to fill the space with normalcy. Miller stepped forward, hesitating. He opened his mouth, perhaps to ask about the report, perhaps to ask if Bentley was fit to stand. Sarge, Miller started. The inspector said, Go home, Miller. But the shift log, it needs, sir. Go home, Bentley turned his back. He faced the wall, the whitewash peeling in long strips like dead skin. Lock the door on your way out. He heard Miller stop. The silence stretched, tight as a wire. Then the sound of retreating boots, slow at first, then quicker, as if the boy was running from a contagion. The door clicked shut. The lock turned. The bolt slid home with a final, metallic clunk that echoed in the empty room. Bentley stood alone. The gaslight hissed. He looked at his hands. They were shaking, not a tremor, but a vibration that started in the bones and worked its way out to the fingertips, making the air around them seem to shimmer. He clenched them into fists. The pain in his knuckles was real, grounding. He focused on it. The pain was better than the voices. The pain belonged to the living. He walked to the rack where the helmets hung. His own cap sat on the peg, the brass badge dull with grime. He reached for it. His fingers brushed the leather peak. It was cold, colder than the room, colder than the January air outside should have allowed. He pulled his hand back. He would not wear it, not yet. Let the cold touch his hair. Let it seep into the skull and freeze the thoughts that tangled there. He turned to the door, the exit, the street, the fog. He could feel it waiting on the other side of the wood, a physical weight pressing against the frame. He placed his hand on the latch. The metal bit into his palm, sharp and unforgiving. He paused. Inside, the roll call echoed. Tucker, Choate, Woodams, three names that had no bodies to answer them, no grave to hold them, no silence to keep them still. They were loose. They were in the walls. They were in the space between his breaths. He pushed the latch down. The mechanism resisted, stiff with cold, then gave way with a groan of protesting iron. He stepped into the vestibule. The outer door waited beyond, a barrier between the machine of the law and the chaos of the city. He could hear the wind now, whistling through the cracks in the masonry, a high, thin note that sounded like a name being called from a great distance. He pulled his coat tight. The wool was damp. It smelled of smoke and river mud. He opened the outer door. The fog rushed in, grey and thick, filling the small space until he could not see his own boots. He stepped forward into the grey. The door swung shut behind him, cutting off the light, leaving him alone with the count that never ended. The Frost and the Fuse is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. A Storm in the Blood, a novel internet archive. The Houndsditch Murders and the Siege of Sydney Street, internet archive. Siege of Sydney Street. Jacobs Peters. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.